The Seven Geases by Asthon Smith. The Lord Ralibar Vuz, High Magistrate of Comorium and third cousin to King Humquat, had gone forth with 26 of his most valorous retainers in quest of such game as was afforded by the black Iglophian mountains, leaving to lesser sportsmen the great sloths and vampire bats of the intermediate jungle, as well as the small but noxious dinosauria. Ralibar Vuz and his followers had pushed rapidly ahead and had covered the distance between the Hyperborean capital and their objective in a day's march. The glassy scars and grim ramparts of Mount Vormithadrith, highest and most formidable of the Iglophians, had beetled above them, wedging the sun with dark scoriac peaks at mid-afternoon and walling the blazonries of sunset wholly from view. They had spent the night beneath its lowermost crags, keeping a ceaseless watch, piling dead branches on their fires, and hearing on the grisly heights above them the wild and dog-like ululations of those subhuman savages, the Vormis for which the mountain was named. Also, they heard the bellowing of an alpine catoblepas pursued by the Vormis, and the mad snarling of a saber-toothed tiger assailed and dragged down, and Ralibar Vuz had deemed that these noises boded well for the morrow's hunting. He and his men rose betimes, and having breakfasted on their provisions of dried bear meat and a dark sour wine that was noted for its invigorative qualities, they began immediately the ascent of the mountain, whose upper precipices were hollow with caves occupied by the Vormis. Ralibar Vuz had hunted these creatures before, and a certain room of his house in Comorium was arrased with their thick and shaggy pelts. They were usually deemed the most dangerous of the Hyperborean fauna, and the mere climbing of Vormithadrith, even without the facing of its inhabitants, would have been a feat attended by more than sufficient peril. But Ralibar Vuz, having tasted of such sport, could now satisfy himself with nothing tamer. He and his followers were well armed and accoutred. Some of the men bore coils of rope and grappling hooks to be employed in the escalade of the steeper crags. Some carried heavy crossbows, and many were equipped with long-handled and saber-bladed bills which, from experience, had proved the most effective weapons in close-range fighting with the Vormis. The whole party was variously studded with auxiliary knives, throwing darts, two-handed scimitars, maces, bodkins, and saw-toothed axes. The men were all clad in jerkins and hose of dinosaur leather, and were shod with brazen spiked buskins. Ralibar Vuz himself wore a light suiting of copper chainmail which, flexible as cloth, in no wise impeded his movements. In addition, he carried a buckler of mammoth hide with a long bronze spike in its center that could be used as a thrusting sword, and being a man of huge stature and strength, his shoulders and baldric were hung with a whole arsenal of weaponries. The mountain was of volcanic origin, though its 4 craters were supposedly all extinct. For hours the climbers toiled upward on the fearsome scarps of black lava and obsidian, seeing the sheerer heights above them recede interminably into a cloudless zenith, as if not to be approached by man. Far faster than they, the sun climbed, blazing torridly upon them and heating the rocks till their hands were scorched as if by the walls of a furnace. But Ralibar Vuz, eager to flesh his weapons, would permit no halting in the shady chasms, nor under the scant umbrage of rare junipers. That day, however, it seemed that the Vormis were not abroad upon Mount Vormithadrith. No doubt they had feasted too well during the night when their hunting cries had been heard by the Comorians. Perhaps it would be necessary to invade the warren of caves in the loftier crags, a procedure none too palatable even for a sportsman of such hardihood as Ralibar Vuz. Few of these caverns could be reached by men without the use of ropes, and the Vormis, who were possessed of quasi-human cunning, would hurl blocks and rubble upon the heads of the assailants. Most of the caves were narrow and darksome, thus putting at a grave disadvantage the hunters who entered them, and the Vormis would fight redoubtably in defense of their young and their females, who dwelt in the inner recesses, and the females were fiercer and more pernicious, if possible, than the males. Such matters as these were debated by Ralibar Vuz and his henchmen as the escalade became more arduous and hazardous, and they saw far above them the pitted mouths of the lower dens. Tales were told of brave hunters who had gone into those dens and had not returned. and much was said of the vile feeding habits of the Vormis and the uses to which their captives were put before death and after it. Also, much was said regarding the genesis of the Vormis, who were popularly believed to be the offspring of women and certain atrocious creatures that had come forth in primal days from a tenebrous cavern world in the bowels of Vormithadrith. Somewhere beneath that four-coned mountain, the sluggish and baleful god Tsathoggua, who had come down from Saturn in years immediately following the Earth's creation, was fabled to reside, and during the rite of worship at his black altars, the devotees were always careful to orient themselves toward Vormithadrith. Other and more doubtful beings than Tsathoggua slept below the extinct volcanoes, or ranged and ravened throughout that hidden underworld. But of these beings few men other than the more adept or abandoned wizards professed to know anything at all. Ralibar Vuz, who had a thoroughly modern disdain of the supernatural, avowed his skepticism in no equivocal terms when he heard his henchmen regaling each other with these antique legendaries. He swore with many ribald blasphemies that there were no gods anywhere, above or under Vormithadrith. As for the Vormis themselves, they were indeed a misbegotten species, but it was hardly necessary in explaining their generation to go beyond the familiar laws of nature. They were merely the remnant of a low and degraded tribe of people, who, sinking further into brutehood, had sought refuge in those volcanic fastnesses after the coming of the true Hyperboreans. Certain grizzled veterans of the party shook their heads and muttered at these heresies, but because of their respect for the high rank and prowess of Ralibar Vuz, they did not venture to gainsay him openly. After several hours of heroic climbing, the hunters came within measurable distance of those nether caves. Below them now, in a vast and dizzying prospect, were the wooded hills and fair, fertile plains of Hyperborea. They were alone in a world of black, raven rock, with innumerable precipices and chasms above, beneath, and on all sides. Directly overhead, in the face of an almost perpendicular cliff, were three of the cavern mouths, which had the aspect of volcanic fumaroles. Much of the cliff was glazed with obsidian, and there were few ledges or hand grips. It seemed that even the Vormis, agile as apes, could scarcely climb that wall, and Ralibar Vuz, after studying it with a strategic eye, decided that the only feasible approach to the dens was from above. A diagonal crack, running from a shelf just below them to the summit, no doubt afforded ingress and egress to their occupants. First, however, it was necessary to gain the precipice above, a difficult and precarious feat in itself. At one side of the long talus on which the hunters were standing, there was a chimney that wound upward in the wall, ceasing 30 feet from the top and leaving a sheer, smooth surface. Working along the chimney to its upper end, a good alpinist could hurl his rope and grappling hook to the summit edge. The advisability of bettering their present vantage was now emphasized by a shower of stones and offal from the caverns. They noted certain human relics, well gnawed and decayed amid the offal. Ralibar Vuz, animated by wrath against these miscreants, as well as by the fervor of the huntsman, led his 26 followers in the escalade. He soon reached the chimney's termination, where a slanting ledge offered bare foothold at one side. After the third cast, his rope held, and he went up hand over hand to the precipice. He found himself on a broad and comparatively level-topped buttress of the lowest cone of Vormithadrith, which still rose for 2,000 feet above him like a steep pyramid. Before him on the buttress, the black lava stone was gnarled into numberless low ridges and strange masses like the pedestals of gigantic columns. Dry, scanty grasses and withered alpine flowers grew here and there in shallow basins of darkish soil, and a few cedars, levin-struck or stunted, had taken root in the fissured rock. Amid the black ridges and seemingly close at hand, a thread of pale smoke ascended, serpentining oddly in the still air of noon and reaching an unbelievable height ere it vanished. Ralibar Vuz inferred that the buttress was inhabited by some person nearer to civilized humanity than the Vormis, who were quite ignorant of the use of fire. Surprised by this discovery, he did not wait for his men to join him, but started off at once to investigate the source of the curling smoke thread. He had deemed it merely a few steps away, behind the first of those grotesque furrows of lava. But evidently he had been deceived in this, for he climbed ridge after ridge and rounded many broad and curious dolmens and great dolomites which rose inexplicably before him where, an instant previous, he had thought they were only ordinary boulders. And still the pale, sinuous wisp went skyward at the same seeming interval. Ralibar Vuz, High Magistrate and redoubtable hunter, was both puzzled and irritated by this behavior of the smoke. Likewise, the aspect of the rocks around him was disconcertingly and unpleasantly deceitful. He was wasting too much time in an exploration idle and quite foreign to the real business of the day. But it was not his nature to abandon any enterprise, no matter how trivial, without reaching the set goal. Hallooing loudly to his men who must have climbed the cliff by now, he went on toward the elusive smoke. It seemed to him once or twice that he heard the answering shouts of his followers, very faint and indistinct, as if across some mile-wide chasm. Again he called lustily, but this time there was no audible reply. Going a little farther, he began to detect among the rocks beside him a peculiar conversational droning and muttering in which 4 or 5 different voices appeared to take part. Seemingly they were much nearer at hand than the smoke, which had now receded like a mirage. One of the voices was clearly that of a Hyperborean, but the others possessed a timbre and accent which Ralibar Vuz, in spite of his varied ethnic knowledge, could not associate with any branch or subdivision of mankind. They affected his ears in a most unpleasant fashion, suggesting by turns the hum of great insects, the murmurs of fire and water, and the rasping of metal. Ralibar Vuz emitted a hearty and somewhat ireful bellow to announce his coming to whatever persons were convened amid the rocks. His weapons and accoutrements clattering loudly, he scrambled over a sharp lava ridge toward the voices. Topping the ridge, he looked down on a scene that was both mysterious and unexpected. Below him, in a circular hollow, there stood a rude hut of boulders and stone fragments roofed with cedar boughs. In front of this hovel, on a large flat block of obsidian, a fire burned with flames alternately blue, green, and white, and from it rose the pale, thin spiral of smoke whose situation had eluded him so strangely. An old man, withered and disreputable-looking, in a robe that appeared no less antique and unsavory than himself, was standing near to the fire. He was not engaged in any visible culinary operations, and in view of the torrid sun, it hardly seemed that he required the warmth given by the queer-colored blaze. Aside from this individual, Ralibar Vuz looked in vain for the participants of the muttered conversation he had just overheard. He thought there was an evanescent fluttering of dim, grotesque shadows around the obsidian block, but the shadows faded and vanished in an instant, and since there were no objects or beings that could have cast them, Ralibar Vuz deemed that he had been victimized by another of those highly disagreeable optic illusions in which that part of the mountain Vormithadreth seemed to abound. The old man eyed the hunter with a fiery gaze and began to curse him in fluent but somewhat archaic diction as he descended into the hollow. At the same time, a lizard-tailed and sooty-feathered bird, which seemed to belong to some night-flying species of Archaeopteryx, began to snap its toothed beak and flap its digited wings on the objectionably shapen stela that served it for a perch. This stela, standing on the lee side of the fire and very close to it, had not been perceived by Ralibar Vuz at first glance.
"May the ordure of demons bemire you from heel to crown,"
cried the venomous ancient.
"O lumbering, bawling idiot, you have ruined a most promising and important evocation. How you came here I cannot imagine. I have surrounded this place with 12 circles of illusion, whose effect is multiplied by their myriad intersections, and the chance that any intruder would ever find his way to my abode was mathematically small and insignificant. Ill was that chance which brought you here, for they that you have frightened away will not return until the high stars repeat a certain rare and quickly passing conjunction. And much wisdom is lost to me in the interim."
"How now, varlet?" said Ralibar Vuz, astonished and angered by this greeting, of which he understood little save that his presence was unwelcome to the old man. "Who are you that speak so churlishly to a magistrate of Comorium and a cousin to King Homquat? I advise you to curb such insolence, for if so I wish, it lies in my power to serve you even as I serve the Vormis." Though methinks, he added, your pelt is far too filthy and verminous to merit room amid my trophies of the chase.
Know that I am the sorcerer Esdagor,
proclaimed the ancient, his voice echoing among the rocks with dreadful sonority.
By choice, I have lived remote from cities and men. Nor have the Vormis of the mountain troubled me in my magical seclusion. I care not if you are the magistrate of all swinedom or a cousin to the king of dogs. In retribution for the charm you have shattered, the business you have undone by this oafish trespass, I shall put upon you a most dire and calamitous and bitter gash.
You speak in terms of outmoded superstition, said Ralibar Vuz, who was impressed against his will by the weighty oratorical style in which Esdagor had delivered these periods. The old man seemed not to hear him.
Hearken then to your gaish, O Ralibar Vuz,
he fulminated.
For this is the gaish, that you must cast aside all your weapons and go unarmed into the dens of the Vormis. And fighting bare-handed against the Vormis and against their females and their young, you must win to that secret cave in the bowels of Vormithadreth beyond the dens, wherein abides from eldermost eons the god Sathogwa. You shall know Sathogwa by his great girth and his bat-like furriness and the look of a sleepy black toad which he has eternally. He will rise not from his place, even in the ravening of hunger, but will wait in divine slothfulness for the sacrifice. And going close to Lord Sathogwa, you must say to him, I am the blood offering sent by the sorcerer Esdagor. Then, if it be his pleasure, Sathogwa will avail himself of the offering. In order that you may not go astray, the bird Raftontis, who is my familiar, will guide you in your wanderings on the mountainside and through the caverns.
He indicated with a peculiar gesture the night-flying Archaeopteryx on the foully symbolic stela, and added, as if in afterthought,
Raftontis will remain with you till the accomplishment of the gaish and the end of your journey below Vormithadreth. He knows the secrets of the underworld and the lairing places of the old ones. If our Lord Sathogwa should disdain the blood offering, or in his generosity should send you on to his brethren, Raftontis will be fully competent to lead the way whithersoever is ordained by the god.
Ralibar Vuz found himself unable to answer this more than outrageous peroration in the style which it manifestly deserved. In fact, he could say nothing at all, for it seemed that a sort of lockjaw had afflicted him. Moreover, to his exceeding terror and bewilderment, this vocal paralysis was accompanied by certain involuntary movements of a most alarming type. With a sense of nightmare compulsion, together with the horror of one who feels that he is going mad, he began to divest himself of the various weapons which he carried. His bladed buckler, his mace, broadsword, hunting knife, axe, and needle-tipped anlace jingled on the ground before the obsidian block.
I shall permit you to retain your helmet and body armor,
said Esdagor at this juncture.
Otherwise, I fear that you will not reach Sathogwa in the state of corporeal intactness proper for a sacrifice. The teeth and nails of the Vormis are sharp, even as their appetites.
Muttering certain half-inaudible and doubtful-sounding words, the wizard turned from Ralibar Vuz and began to quench the tricolored fire with a mixture of dust and blood from a shallow brass basin. Deigning to vouchsafe no farewell or sign of dismissal, he kept his back toward the hunter, but waved his left hand obliquely to the bird Raftontis. This creature, stretching his murky wings and clacking his saw-like beak, abandoned his perch and hung poised in air with one ember-colored eye malignly fixed on Ralibar Vuz. Then, floating slowly, his long snakish neck reverted and his eye maintaining its vigilance, the bird flew among the lava ridges toward the pyramidal cone of Vormithadreth, and Ralibar Vuz followed, driven by a compulsion that he could neither understand nor resist. Evidently the demon-fowl knew all the turnings of that maze of delusion with which Esdagor had environed his abode, for the hunter was led with comparatively little indirection across the enchanted buttress. He heard the far-off shouting of his men as he went. but his own voice was faint and thin as that of a flittermouse when he sought to reply. Soon he found himself at the bottom of a great scrap of the upper mountain, pitted with cavern mouths. It was a part of Vormithadreth that he had never visited before. Raftontis rose toward the lowest cave, and hovered at its entrance while Ralabar Vuz climbed precariously behind him, amid a heavy barrage of bones and glass-edged flints, and other oddments of less mentionable nature hurled by the Vormis. These low, brutal savages, fringing the dark mouths of the dens with their repulsive faces and members, greeted the hunter's progress with ferocious howlings and an inexhaustible supply of garbage. However, they did not molest Raftontis, and it seemed that they were anxious to avoid hitting him with their missiles, though the presence of this hovering, wide-winged fowl interfered noticeably with their aim as Ralabar Vuz began to near the nethermost den. Owing to this partial protection, the hunter was able to reach the cavern without serious injury. The entrance was rather straight, and Raftontis flew upon the Vormis with open beak and flapping wings, compelling them to withdraw into the interior, while Ralabar Vuz made firm his position on the threshold ledge. Some, however, threw themselves on their faces to allow the passage of Raftontis, and rising when the bird had gone by, they assailed the Comorian as he followed his guide into the fetid gloom. They stood only half erect, and their shaggy heads were about his thighs and hips, snarling and snapping like dogs, and they clawed him with hook-shaped nails that caught and held in the links of his armor. Weaponless, he fought them in obedience to his geash, striking down their hideous faces with his mailed fist in a veritable madness that was not akin to the ardor of a huntsman. He felt their nails and teeth break on the close-woven links as he hurled them loose, but others took their places when he won onward a little into the murky cavern, and their females struck at his legs like darting serpents, and their young beslavered his ankles with mouths wherein the fangs were as yet ungrown. Before him, for his guidance, he heard the clanking of the wings of Raftontis, and the harsh cries, half hiss and half caw, that were emitted by this bird at intervals. The darkness stifled him with 1,000 stenches, and his feet slipped in blood and filth at every step. But anon he knew that the Vormis had ceased to assail him. The cave sloped downward, and he breathed an air that was edged with sharp, acrid mineral odors. Groping for a while through sightless night, and descending a steep incline, he came to a sort of underground hall in which neither day or darkness prevailed. Here the archings of rock were visible by an obscure glow, such as hidden moons might yield. Thence, through declivitous grottos and along perilously skirted gulfs, he was conducted ever downward by Raftontis into the world beneath the mountain Vormithadreth. Everywhere was that dim, unnatural light whose source he could not ascertain. Wings that were too broad for those of the bat flew vaguely overhead, and at whiles in the shadowy caverns he beheld great fearsome bulks having a likeness to those behemoths and giant reptiles which burdened the earth in earlier times. But because of the dimness he could not tell if these were living shapes or forms that the stone had taken. Strong was the compulsion of his geash on Ralabar Vuz, and a numbness had seized his mind, and he felt only a dulled fear and a dazed wonder. It seemed that his will and his thoughts were no longer his own, but were become those of some alien person. He was going down to some obscure but predestined end, by a route that was darksome but foreknown. At last the bird Raftontis paused and hovered significantly in a cave distinguished from the others by a most evil potpourri of smells. Ralabar Vuz deemed at first that the cave was empty. Going forward to join Raftontis, he stumbled over certain attenuated remnants on the boor, which appeared to be the skin-clad skeletons of men and various animals. Then, following the coal-bright gaze of the demon bird, he discerned in a dark recess the formless bulking of a Kuchan mass. And the mass stirred a little at his approach, and put forth with infinite slothfulness a huge and toad-shaped head, and the head opened its eyes very slightly, as if half awakened from slumber, so that they were visible as two slits of oozing phosphor in the black, browless face. Ralabar Vuz perceived an odor of fresh blood amid the many feters that rose to besiege his nostrils. A horror came upon him therewith, for looking down he beheld lying before the shadowy monster the lean husk of a thing that was neither man, beast, nor Vormi. He stood hesitant, fearing to go closer yet powerless to retreat, but admonished by an angry hissing from the Archaeopteryx, together with a slashing stroke of its beak between his shoulder blades. He went forward till he could see the fine, dark fur on the dormant body and sleepily erected head. With new horror and a sense of hideous doom, he heard his own voice speaking without volition. "O Lord Sathogwa, I am the blood offering sent by the sorcerer Esdagor." There was a sluggish inclination of the toad-like head, and the eyes opened a little wider, and light flowed from them in viscous tricklings on the creased underlids. Then Ralabar Vuz seemed to hear a deep rumbling sound. Batty knew not whether it reverberated in the dusky air or in his own mind, and the sound shaped itself, albeit uncouthly, into syllables and words.
"Thanks are due to Esdagor for this offering. But since I have fed lately on a well-blooded sacrifice, my hunger is appeased for the present, and I require not the offering. However, it may be that others of the old ones are athirst or famished. And since you came here with a geish upon you, it is not fitting that you should go hence without another. So I place you under this geish, to betake yourself downward through the caverns till you reach, after long descent, that bottomless gulf over which the spider god Atlach-Nacha weaves his eternal webs. And there, calling to Atlach-Nacha, you must say, 'I am the gift sent by Sathogwa.'"
So, with Raftontis leading him, Ralabar Vuz departed from the presence of Sathogwa by another route than that which had brought him there. The way steepened more and more, and it ran through chambers that were too vast for the searching of sight, and along precipices that fell sheer for an unknown distance to the black, sluggish form and somnolent murmur of underworld seas. At last, on the verge of a chasm whose farther shore was lost in darkness, the night-flying bird hung motionless with level wings and down-dropping tail. Ralabar Vuz went close to the verge and saw that great webs were attached to it at intervals, seeming to span the gulf with their multiple crossing and reticulations of gray, rope-thick strands. Apart from these, the chasm was bridgeless. Far out on one of the webs he discerned a darksome form, big as a crouching man but with long, spider-like members. Then, like a dreamer who hears some nightmare sound, he heard his own voice crying loudly, "O Atlach-Nacha, I am the gift sent by Sathogwa." The dark form ran toward him with incredible swiftness. When it came near, he saw that there was a kind of face on the squat, ebon body, low down amid the several jointed legs. The face peered up with a weird expression of doubt and inquiry, and terror crawled through the veins of the bold huntsman as he met the small, crafty eyes that were circled about with hair. Thin, shrill, piercing as a sting, there spoke to him the voice of the spider god Atlach-Nacha.
"I am duly grateful for the gift, but since there is no one else to bridge this chasm, and since eternity is required for the task, I cannot spend my time in extracting you from those curious shards of metal. However, it may be that the anti-human sorcerer Haondor, who abides beyond the gulf in his palace of primal enchantments, can somehow find a use for you. The bridge I have just now completed runs to the threshold of his abode, and your weight will serve to test the strength of my weaving. Go then, with this geish upon you, to cross the bridge and present yourself before Haondor, saying, 'Atlach-Nacha has sent me.'"
With these words, the spider god withdrew his bulk from the web and ran quickly from sight along the chasm edge, doubtless to begin the construction of a new bridge at some remoter point. Though the third geish was heavy and compulsive upon him, Ralabar Vuz followed Raftontis none too willingly over the night-bound depths. The weaving of Atlach-Nacha was strong beneath his feet, giving and swaying only a little, but between the strands, in unfathomable space below, he seemed to descry the dim flitting of dragons with claw-tipped wings, and like a seething of the darkness, fearful hulks without name appeared to heave and sink from moment to moment. However, he and his guide came presently to the gulf's opposite shore, where the web of Atlach-Nacha was joined to the lowest step of a mighty stairway. The stairs were guarded by a coiled snake, whose mottlings were broad as bucklers, and whose middle volumes exceeded in girth the body of a stout warrior. The horny tail of this serpent rattled like a sistrum, and he thrust forth an evil head with fangs that were long as billhooks. But, seeing Raftontis, he drew his coils aside and permitted Ralabar Vuz to ascend the steps. Thus, in fulfillment of the third Gaish, the hunter entered the 1,000-columned palace of Haondor. Strange and silent were those halls hewn from the gray, fundamental rock of earth. In them were faceless forms of smoke and mist that went uneasily to and fro, and statues representing monsters with myriad heads. In the vaults above, as if hung aloof in night, lamps burned with inverse flames that were like the combustion of ice and stone. A chill spirit of evil, ancient beyond all conception of man, was abroad in those halls, and horror and fear crept throughout them like invisible serpents, unknotted from sleep. Threading the mazy chambers with the surety of one accustomed to all their windings, Raftontis conducted Ralabar Vuz to a high room whose walls described a circle, broken only by the one portal through which he entered. The room was empty of furnishment, save for a 5-pillared seat rising so far aloft without stairs or other means of approach that it seemed only a winged being could ever attain thereto. But on the seat was a figure shrouded with thick sable darkness, and having over its head and features a caul of grisly shadow. The bird Raftontis hovered ominously before the columned chair, and Ralabar Vuz in astonishment heard a voice saying, "O Haondor, Atlach-Nacha has sent me." And not till the voice ceased speaking did he know it for his own. For a long time the silence seemed infrangible. There was no stirring of the high-seated figure, but Ralabar Vuz, peering trepidantly at the walls about him, beheld their former smoothness embossed with 1,000 faces, twisted and awry like those of mad devils. The faces were thrust forward on necks that lengthened, and behind the necks mal-shapen shoulders and bodies emerged inch by inch from the stone, craning toward the huntsman. And beneath his feet the very floor was now cobbled with other faces, turning and tossing restlessly, and opening ever wider their demoniacal mouths and eyes. At last the shrouded figure spoke, and though the words were of no mortal tongue, it seemed to the listener that he comprehended them darkly.
My thanks are due to Atlach-Nacha for this sending. If I appear to hesitate, it is only because I am doubtful regarding what disposition I can make of you. My familiars who crowd the walls and floors of this chamber would devour you all too readily, but you would serve only as a morsel amid so many. On the whole, I believe that the best thing I can do is to send you on to my allies, the Serpent People. They are scientists of no ordinary attainment, and perhaps you might provide some special ingredient required in their chemistries. Consider, then, that a gaish has been put upon you, and take yourself off to the caverns in which the Serpent People reside.
Obeying this injunction, Ralabar Vuz went down through the darkest strata of that primeval underworld. Beneath the palace of Haondor, the guidance of Raftontis never failed him, and he came anon to the spacious caverns in which the serpent men were busying themselves with a multitude of tasks. They walked lithely and sinuously erect on pre-mammalian members, their pied and hairless bodies bending with great suppleness. There was a loud and constant hissing of formulae as they went to and fro. Some were smelting the black nether ores, some were blowing molten obsidian into forms of flask and urn, some were measuring chemicals, others were decanting strange liquids and curious colloids. In their intense preoccupation, none of them seemed to notice the arrival of Ralabar Vuz and his guide. After the hunter had repeated many times the message given him by Haondor, one of the walking reptiles at last perceived his presence. This being eyed him with cold but highly disconcerting curiosity, and then emitted a sonorous hiss that was audible above all the noises of labor and converse. The other serpent men ceased their toil immediately and began to crowd around Ralabar Vuz. From the tone of their sibilations, it seemed that there was much argument among them. Certain of their number sidled close to the Comorian, touching his face and hands with their chill, scaly digits, and prying beneath his armor. He felt that they were anatomizing him with methodical minuteness. At the same time, he perceived that they paid no attention to Raftontis, who had perched himself on a large alembic. After a while, some of the chemists went away and returned quickly, bearing among them 2 great jars of glass filled with a clear liquid. In one of the jars there floated upright a well-developed and mature male vormi. in the other a large and equally perfect specimen of Hyperborean manhood, not without a sort of general likeness to Ralibar Vuz himself. The bearers of these specimens deposited their burdens beside the hunter, and then each of them delivered what was doubtless a learned dissertation on comparative biology. This series of lectures, unlike many such, was quite brief. At the end, the reptilian chemists returned to their various labors, and the jars were removed. One of the scientists then addressed himself to Ralibar Vuz with a fair, though somewhat sibilant approximation of human speech.
It was thoughtful of Houndor to send you here. However, as you have seen, we are already supplied with an exemplar of your species, and in the past, we have thoroughly dissected others and have learned all that there is to learn regarding this very uncouth and aberrant life form. Also, since our chemistry is devoted almost wholly to the production of powerful toxic agents, we can find no use in our tests and manufactures for the extremely ordinary matters of which your body is composed. They are without pharmaceutic value. Moreover, we have long abandoned the eating of impure natural foods, and now confine ourselves to synthetic types of aliment. There is, as you must realize, no place for you in our economy. However, it may be that the archetypes can somehow dispose of you. At least you will be a novelty to them, since no example of contemporary human evolution has so far descended to their stratum. Therefore, we shall put you under that highly urgent and imperative kind of hypnosis which, in the parlance of warlockry, is known as a geish. And, obeying the hypnosis, you will go down to the cavern of the archetypes.
The region to which the magistrate of Comorium was now conducted lay at some distance below the Ophidian laboratories. The air of the gulfs and grottos along his way began to increase markedly in warmth, and was moist and steamy as that of some equatorial fen. A primordial luminosity, such as might have dawned before the creation of any sun, seemed to surround and pervade everything. All about him in this thick and semi-aqueous light, the hunter discerned the rocks and fauna and vegetable forms of a crassly primitive world. These shapes were dim, uncertain, wavering, and were all composed of loosely organized elements. Even in this bizarre and more than doubtful terrain of the under-earth, Raftantis seemed wholly at home, and he flew on amid the sketchy plants and cloudy-looking boulders as if at no loss whatever in orienting himself. But Ralibar Vuz, in spite of the spell that stimulated and compelled him onward, had begun to feel a fatigue by no means unnatural in view of his prolonged and heroic itinerary. Also, he was much troubled by the elasticity of the ground, which sank beneath him at every step like an oversodded marsh, and seemed insubstantial to a quite alarming degree. To his further disconcertion, he soon found that he had attracted the attention of a huge, foggy monster with the rough outlines of a tyrannosaurus. This creature chased him amid the archetypal ferns and club mosses, and overtaking him after 5 or 6 bounds, it proceeded to ingest him with the celerity of any latter-day saurian of the same species. Luckily, the ingestment was not permanent, for the Tyrannosaurus's body plasm, though fairly opaque, was more astral than material, and Ralibar Vuz, protesting stoutly against his confinement in its maw, felt the dark walls give way before him and tumbled out on the ground. After its third attempt to devour him, the monster must have decided that he was inedible. It turned and went away with immense leapings in search of comestibles on its own plane of matter. Ralibar Vuz continued his progress through the cavern of the archetypes, a progress often delayed by the alimentary designs of crude, misty-stomached allosaurs, pterodactyls, pteranodons, stegosaurs, and other carnivora of the prime. At last, following his experience with a most persistent megalosaur, he beheld before him 2 entities of vaguely human outline. They were gigantic, with bodies almost globular in form, and they seemed to float rather than walk. Their features, though shadowy to the point of inchoateness, appeared to express aversion and hostility. They drew near to the Comorian, and he became aware that one of them was addressing him. The language used was wholly a matter of primitive vowel sounds, but a meaning was forcibly, though indistinctly, conveyed.
We, the originals of mankind, are dismayed by the sight of a copy so coarse and egregiously perverted from the true model. We disown you with sorrow and indignation. Your presence here is an unwarrantable intrusion, and it is obvious that you are not to be assimilated even by our most esurient dinosaurs. Therefore we put you under a gaish. Depart without delay from the cavern of the archetypes, and seek out the slimy gulf in which Abhoth, father and mother of all cosmic uncleanness, eternally carries on its repugnant fission. We consider that you are fit only for Abhoth, which will perhaps mistake you for one of its own progeny and devour you in accordance with the custom which it follows.
The weary hunter was led by the untirable Raftontis to a deep cavern on the same level as that of the archetypes. Possibly it was a kind of annex to the latter. At any rate, the ground was much firmer there, even though the air was murkier, and Ralabar Vuz might have recovered a little of his customary aplomb, if it had not been for the ungodly and disgusting creatures which he soon began to meet. There were things which he could liken only to monstrous one-legged toads, and immense myriad-tailed worms, and miscreated lizards. They came flopping or crawling through the gloom in a ceaseless procession, and there was no end to the loathsome morphologic variations which they displayed. Unlike the archetypes, they were formed of all too solid matter, and Ralabar Vuz was both fatigued and nauseated by the constant necessity of kicking them away from his shins. He was somewhat relieved to find, however, that these wretched abortions became steadily smaller as he continued his advance. The dusk about him thickened with hot, evil steam that left an oozy deposit on his armor and bare face and hands. With every breath he inhaled an odor noisome beyond imagining. He stumbled and slipped on the crawling foulnesses underfoot. Then in that reeky twilight he saw the pausing of Raftontis, and below the demoniac bird he descried a sort of pool with a margin of mud that was marled with obscene offal, and in the pool a grayish, horrid mass that nearly choked it from rim to rim. Here, it seemed, was the ultimate source of all miscreation and abomination, for the gray mass quabbed and quivered and swelled perpetually, and from it, in manifold fission, were spawned the anatomies that crept away on every side through the grotto. There were things like bodiless legs or arms that flailed in the slime, or heads that rolled, or floundering bellies with fishes' fins, and all manner of things malformed and monstrous, that grew in size as they departed from the neighborhood of Abhoth, and those that swam not swiftly ashore when they fell into the pool from Abhoth were devoured by mouths that gaped in the parent bulk. Ralabar Vuz was beyond thought, beyond horror, in his weariness. Else he would have known intolerable shame, seeing that he had come to the bourne ordained for him by the archetypes as most fit and proper. A deadness near to death was upon his faculties, and he heard as if remote and high above him a voice that proclaimed to Abhoth the reason of his coming, and he did not know that the voice was his own. There was no sound in answer, but out of the lumpy mass there grew a member that stretched and lengthened toward Ralabar Vuz, where he stood waiting on the pool's margin. The member divided to a flat, webby hand, soft and slimy, which touched the hunter and went over his person slowly from foot to head. Having done this, it seemed that the thing had served its use, for it dropped quickly away from Abhoth and wriggled into the gloom like a serpent together with the other progeny. Still waiting, Ralabar Vuz felt in his brain a sensation as of speech heard without words or sound, and the import, rendered in human language, was somewhat as follows.
I, who am Abhoth, the coeval of the oldest gods, consider that the archetypes have shown a questionable taste in recommending you to me. After careful inspection, I failed to recognize you as one of my relatives or progeny, though I must admit that I was nearly deceived at first by certain biologic similarities. You are quite alien to my experience, and I do not care to endanger my digestion with untried articles of diet. Who you are, or whence you have come, I cannot surmise, nor can I thank the archetypes for troubling the profound and placid fertility of my existence with a problem so vexatious as the one that you offer. Get hence, I adjure you. There is a bleak and drear and dreadful limbo, known as the outer world, of which I have heard dimly, and I think that it might prove a suitable objective for your journeying. I settle an urgent gaish upon you. Go seek this outer world with all possible expedition.
Apparently, Raftontis realized that it was beyond the physical powers of his charge to fulfill the seventh gaish without an interim of repose. He led the hunter to one of the numerous exits of the grotto inhabited by Abhoth, an exit giving on regions altogether unknown, opposite to the cavern of the archetypes. There, with significant gestures of his wings and beak, the bird indicated a sort of narrow alcove in the rock. The recess was dry and by no means uncomfortable as a sleeping place. Ralabar Vuz was glad to lay himself down, and a black tide of slumber rolled upon him with the closing of his eyelids. Raftontis remained on guard before the alcove, discouraging with strokes of his bill the wandering progeny of Abhoth that tried to assail the sleeper. Since there was neither night nor day in that subterrene world, the term of oblivion enjoyed by Ralabar Vuz was hardly to be measured by the usual method of time-telling. He was aroused by the noise of vigorously flapping wings, and saw beside him the foul Raftontis, holding in his beak an unsavory object whose anatomy was that of a fish rather than anything else. Where or how he had caught this creature during his constant vigil was a more than dubious matter. But Ralabar Vuz had fasted too long to be squeamish. He accepted and devoured the proffered breakfast without ceremony. After that, in conformity with the geis laid upon him by Abhoth, he resumed his journey back to the outer earth. The route chosen by Raftontis was presumably a shortcut. Anyhow, it was remote from the cloudy cave of the archetypes, and the laboratories in which the serpent men pursued their arduous toils and toxicological researches. Also, the enchanted palace of Houndor was omitted from the itinerary. But after long, tedious climbing through a region of desolate crags and over a sort of underground plateau, the traveler came once more to the verge of that far-stretching, bottomless chasm, which was bridged only by the webs of the spider god Atlach-Nacha. For some time past he had hurried his pace because of certain of the progeny of Abhoth, who had followed him from the start, and had grown steadily bigger after the fashion of their kind, till they were now large as young tigers or bears. However, when he approached the nearest bridge, he saw that a ponderous and sloth-like entity preceding him had already begun to cross it. The posteriors of this being was studded with unamiable eyes, and Ralabar Vuz was unsure for a little regarding its exact orientation. Not wishing to tread too closely upon the reverted talons of its heels, he waited till the monster had disappeared in the darkness, and by that time the spawn of Abhoth were hard upon him. Raftontis, with sharp admonitory cawings, floated before him above the giant web, and he was impelled to a rash haste by the imminently slavering snouts of the dark abnormalities behind. Owing to such precipitancy, he failed to notice that the web had been weakened and some of its strands torn or stretched by the weight of the sloth-like monster. Coming in view of the chasm's opposite verge, he thought only of reaching it, and redoubled his pace. But at this point the web gave way beneath him. He caught wildly at the broken, dangling strands, but could not arrest his fall. With several pieces of Atlach-Nacha's weaving clutched in his fingers, he was precipitated into that gulf which no one had ever voluntarily tried to plumb. This, unfortunately, was a contingency that had not been provided against by the terms of the seventh geis.
The Coming of the White Worm by Clark Ashton Smith. Chapter 9 of the Book of Abon, rendered from the old French manuscript of Gaspard Dunor. Evar the warlock, dwelling beside the boreal sea, was aware of many strange and untimely portents in midsummer. Frorelli burned the sun above Mu-Thulan from a welkin clear and oneish as ice. At eve the aurora was hung from zenith to earth, like an arras in a high chamber of gods. Wan and rare were the poppies and small the anemones in the cliff-sequestered vales lying behind the house of Evar, and the fruits in his walled garden were pale of rind and green at the core. Also, he beheld by day the unseasonable flight of great multitudes of fowl, going southward from the hidden isles beyond Mu-Thulan, and by night he heard the distressful clamour of other passing multitudes, and always in the loud wind and crying surf he hearkened to the weird whisper of voices from realms of perennial winter. Now Evar was troubled by these portents, even as the rude fisher-folk on the shore of the haven below his house were troubled. Being a past master of all sortilege and a seer of remote and future things, he made use of his arts in an effort to divine their meaning. but a cloud was upon his eyes through the daytime, and a darkness thwarted him when he sought illumination in dreams. His most cunning horoscopes were put to naught. His familiars were silent or answered him equivocally, and confusion was amid all his geomancies and hydromancies and haruspications. And it seemed to Eve that an unknown power worked against him, mocking and making impotent in such fashion the sorcery that none had defeated heretofore. And Eve knew, by certain tokens perceptible to wizards, that the power was an evil power, and its boding was of bale to man. Day by day, through the middle summer, the fisher-folk went forth in their coracles of elk hide and willow, casting their seines. But in the seines they drew dead fishes, blasted as if by fire or extreme cold, and they drew living monsters, such as their eldest captains had never beheld, things triple-headed and tailed and finned with horror, black shapeless things that turned to a liquid foulness and ran away from the net, or headless things like bloated moons with green frozen rays about them, or things leprous-eyed and bearded with stiffly oozing slime. Then out of the sea horizon north, where ships from Cern Goth were wont to ply among the Arctic islands, a galley came drifting with idle oars and aimlessly veering helm. The tide beached it among the boats of the fishermen, which fared no longer to sea, but were drawn up on the sands below the cliff-built house of Evar. And, thronging about the galley in awe and wonder, the fishers beheld its oarsmen still at the oars and its captain at the helm. But the faces and hands of all were stark as bone and were white as the flesh of leprosy, and the pupils of their open eyes had faded strangely, being indistinguishable now from the whites, and a blankness of horror was within them, like ice in deep pools that are fast frozen to the bottom. And Eva himself, descending later, also beheld the galley's crew, and pondered much concerning the import of this prodigy. Loath were the fishers to touch the dead men, and they murmured, saying that a doom was upon the sea, and a curse upon all seafaring things and people. But Evar, deeming that the bodies would rot in the sun and would breed pestilence, commanded them to build a pile of driftwood about the galley, and when the pile had risen above the bulwarks, hiding from view the dead rowers, he fired it with his own hands. High flamed the pile, and smoke ascended black as a storm cloud, and was borne in windy volumes past the tall towers of Ivar on the cliff. But later, when the fire sank, the bodies of the oarsmen were seen sitting amid the mounded embers, and their arms were still outstretched in the attitude of rowing, and their fingers were clenched, though the oars had now dropped away from them in brands and ashes, and the captain of the galley stood upright still in his place, though the burnt helm had fallen beside him. Naught but the raiment of the marble corpses had been consumed, and they shone white as moon-washed marble above the charrings of wood, and nowhere upon them was there any blackness from the fire. Deeming this thing an ill miracle, the fishers were all aghast, and they fled swiftly to the uppermost rocks. There remained with Ivar only his two servants, the boy Ratha and the ancient crone Ahilidis, who had both witnessed many of his conjurations and were thus well inured to sights of magic. And with these two beside him, the sorcerer awaited the cooling of the brands. Quickly the brands darkened, but smoke arose from them still throughout the noon and afternoon, and still they were over-hot for human treading when the hour drew toward sunset. So Ivar bade his servants to fetch water in urns from the sea and cast it upon the ashes and charrings. And after the smoke and the hissing had died, he went forward and approached the pale corpses. Nearing them, he was aware of a great coldness, such as would emanate from trans-Arctic ice, and the coldness began to ache in his hands and ears and smote sharply through the mantle of fur. Going still closer, he touched one of the bodies with his forefinger-tip, and the finger, though lightly pressed and quickly withdrawn, was seared as if by flame. Ivar was much amazed, for the condition of the corpses was a thing unknown to him heretofore, and in all his science of wizardry there was naught to enlighten him. He bethought him that a spell had been laid upon the dead, an ensorceling such as the wan-polar demons might weave, or the chill witches of the moon might devise in their caverns of snow, and he deemed it well to retire for the time lest the spell should now take effect upon others than the dead. Returning to his house ere night, he burned at each door and window the gums that are most offensive to the northern demons, and at each angle where a spirit might enter, he posted one of his own familiars to guard against all intrusion. Afterwards, while Rata and Ahilidis slept, he perused with sedulous care the writings of Panom, in which are collated many powerful exorcisms, but ever and anon, as he read again, for his comfort, the old rubrics, he remembered ominously the saying of the prophet Lith, which no man had understood. There is one that inhabits the place of utter cold, and one that respireth where none other may draw breath. In the days to come he shall issue forth among the isles and cities of men, and shall bring with him as a white doom the wind that slumbereth in his dwelling. Though a fire burned in the chamber, piled with fat pine and terebinth, it seemed that a deadly chill began to invade the air toward midnight. Then, as Ivar turned uneasily from the parchments of Panom and saw that the fires blazed high as if in no need of replenishment, he heard the sudden turmoil of a great wind full of seabirds eerily shrieking, and the cries of landfowl driven on helpless wings, and over all a high laughter of diabolic voices. Madly from the north the wind beat upon his square-based towers, and birds were cast like blown leaves of autumn against the stout-paned windows, and devils seemed to tear and strain at the granite walls. Though the room's door was shut and the windows were tight closed, an icy gust went round and round, circling the table where Ivar sat, snatching the broad parchments of Nom from beneath his fingers and plucking at the lamp flame. Vainly, with numbing thoughts, he strove to recall that counter-charm which is most effective against the spirits of the boreal quarter. Then, strangely, it seemed that the wind fell, leaving a mighty stillness about the house. The chill gust was gone from the room, the lamp and the fire burned steadily, and something of warmth returned slowly into the half-frozen marrow of Ivar. Soon he was made aware of a light shining beyond his chamber windows, as if a belated moon had now risen above the rocks. But Ivar knew that the moon was at that time a thin crescent, declining with eventide. It seemed that the light shone from the north, pale and frigid as fire of ice, and going to the window he beheld a great beam that traversed all the sea, coming as if from the hidden pole. In that light the rocks were paler than marble, and the sands were whiter than sea salt, and the huts of the fishermen were as white tombs. The walled garden of Ivar was full of the beam, and all the green had departed from its foliage, and its blossoms were like flowers of snow. And the beam fell bleakly on the lower walls of his house, but left still in shadow the wall of that upper chamber from which he looked. He thought that the beam poured from a pale cloud that had mounted above the sea line, or else from a white peak that had lifted skyward in the night. But of this he was uncertain. Watching, he saw that it rose higher in the heavens but climbed not upon his walls. Pondering in vain the significance of the mystery, he seemed to hear in the air about him a sweet and wizard voice, and speaking in a tongue that he knew not, the voice uttered a rune of slumber, and Ivar could not resist the rune, and upon him fell such a numbness of sleep as overcomes the outworn watcher in a place of snow. Walking stiffly at dawn, he rose up from the floor where he had lain, and witnessed a strange marvel. For lo, in the harbour there towered an iceberg such as no vessel had yet sighted in all its seafaring to the north, and no legend had told of among the dim Hyperborean isles. It filled the broad haven from shore to shore, and sheered up to a height immeasurable with piled escarpments and tiered precipices, and its pinnacles hung like towers in the zenith above the house of Ivar. It was higher than the dread mountain Akaravomas, which belches rivers of flame and liquid stone that pour unquenched through Tchoval Panomi to the austral main. It was steeper than the mountain Yarok, which marks the site of the boreal pole, and from it there fell a wan glittering on sea and land. Deathly and terrible was the glittering, and Ivar knew that this was the light he had beheld in the darkness. Scarce could he draw breath in the cold that was on the air, and the light of the huge iceberg seared his eyeballs with an exceeding frawness. Yet he perceived an odd thing, that the rays of the glittering fell indirectly and to either side of his house, and the lower chambers, where Rata and Ahilidis slept, were no longer touched by the beam as in the night, and upon all his house there was naught but the early sun and the morning shadows. On the shore below he saw the charrings of the beached galley, and amid them the white corpses incombustible by fire, and along the sands and rocks the fisherfolk were lying or standing upright in still rigid postures, as if they had come forth from their hiding places to behold the pale beam and had been smitten by a magic sleep. And the whole harbour shore, and the garden of Ivar, even to the front threshold of his house, was like a place where frost has fallen thickly over all. Again he remembered the saying of Lith, and with much foreboding he descended to the ground story. There, at the northern windows, the boy Rata and the hag Ahilidis were leaning with faces turned to the light. Stiffly they stood, with wide open eyes, and a pale terror was in their regard, and upon them was the white death of the galley's crew. And nearing them, the sorcerer was stayed by the terrible chillness that smote upon him from their bodies. He would have fled from the house, knowing his magic wholly ineffectual against this thing. But it came to him that death was in the direct falling of the rays from the iceberg, and leaving the house, he must perforce enter that fatal light. And it came to him also that he alone, of all who dwelt on that shore, had been exempted from the death. He could not surmise the reason of his exemption, but in the end he deemed it best to remain patiently and without fear, waiting whatever should befall. Returning to his chamber, he busied himself with various conjurations, but his familiars had gone away in the night, forsaking the angles at which he had posted them, and no spirit either human or demoniacal made reply to his questions, and not in any way known to wizards could he learn aught of the iceberg, or divine the least inkling of its secret. Presently, as he laboured with his useless cantrips, he felt on his face the breathing of a wind that was not air, but a subtler and rarer element cold as the moon's ether. His own breath forsook him with agonies unspeakable, and he fell down on the floor in a sort of swoon that was near to death. In the swoon he was doubtfully aware of voices uttering unfamiliar spells. Invisible fingers touched him with icy pangs, and about him came and went a bleak radiance, like a tide that flows and ebbs and flows again. Intolerable was the radiance to all his senses, but it brightened slowly, with briefer ebbings, and in time his eyes and his flesh were tempered to endure it. Full upon him now was the light of the iceberg through his northern windows, and it seemed that a great eye regarded him in the light. He would have risen to confront the eye, but his swoon held him like a palsy. After that, he slept again for a period. Waking, he found in all his limbs their wonted strength and quickness. The strange light was still upon him, filling all his chamber, and peering out he witnessed a new marvel. For lo, his garden and the rocks and sea sands below it were visible no longer. In their stead were level spaces of ice about his house, and tall ice pinnacles that rose like towers from the broad battlements of a fortress. Beyond the verges of the ice he beheld a sea that lay remotely and far beneath, and beyond the sea the low looming of a dim shore. Terror came to Ivar now, for he recognized in all this the workings of a sorcery plenipotent and beyond the power of all mortal wizards. For plain it was that his high house of granite stood no longer on the coast of Mu Thulan, but was based now on some upper crag of the iceberg. Trembling, he knelt then and prayed to the Old Ones, who dwell secretly in subterrene caverns, or abide under the sea, or in the supermundane spaces. And even as he prayed, he heard a loud knocking at the door of his house. In much fear and wonder, he descended and flung wide the portals. Before him were two men, or creatures who had the likeness of men. Both were strange of visage and bright-skinned, and they wore for mantles such rune-woven stuffs as wizards wear. The runes were uncouth and alien, but when the man bespoke him he understood something of their speech, which was in a dialect of the Hyperborean Isles. "We serve the one whose coming was foretold by the prophet Lith," they said. "From spaces beyond the limits of the north, he hath come in his floating citadel, the ice mountain Yikilth. to voyage the mundane oceans, and to blast with a chill spend-hour the puny peoples of humankind. He hath spared us alone amid the inhabitants of the broad isle Thulask, and hath taken us to go with him in his seafaring upon Yikilth. He hath tempered our flesh to the rigour of his abode, and hath made respirable for us the air in which no mortal man may draw breath. Thee also he hath spared and hath acclimated by his spells to the coldness and the thin ether that go everywhere with Yikilth. Hail, O Eva, whom we know for a great wizard by this token, since only the mightiest of warlocks are thus chosen and exempted. Sorely astonished was Eva, but seeing that he had now to deal with men who were as himself, he questioned closely the two magicians of Thulask. They were named Duni and Ux-Lodden, and were wise in the lore of the elder gods. The name of the one that they served was Relim Shakorth, and he dwelt in the highest summit of the ice mountain. They told Eva nothing of the nature or properties of Relim Shakorth, and concerning their own service to this being, they avowed only that it consisted of such worship as is given to a god, together with the repudiation of all bonds that had linked them heretofore to mankind. And they told Eva that he was to go with them before Relim Shakorth and perform the due rite of obeisance and accept the bond of final alienage. So Evak went with Duni and Ux-Lodden and was led by them to a great pinnacle of ice that rose unmeltable into the one sun, beetling above all its fellows on the flat top of the berg. The pinnacle was hollow, and climbing therein by stairs of ice, they came at last to the chamber of Relim Shakorth, which was a circular dome with a round block at the centre, forming a dais. And on the dais was that being whose advent prophet Lith had foretold obscurely. At sight of this entity, the pulses of Eva were stilled for an instant by terror, and following quickly upon the terror, his gorge rose within him through excess of loathing. In all the world there was naught that could be likened for its foulness to Relim Shakorth. Something he had of the semblance of a fat white worm, but his bulk was beyond that of the sea elephant. His half-coiled tail was thick as the middle folds of his body, and his front reared upward from the dais in the form of a white round disc, and upon it were imprinted vaguely the lineaments of a visage belonging neither to beast of the earth nor ocean creature. And amid the visage a mouth curved uncleanly from side to side of the disc, opening and shutting incessantly on a pale and tongueless and toothless maw. The eye sockets of Relim Shakorth were close together between his shallow nostrils, and the sockets were eyeless, but in them appeared from moment to moment globules of a blood-coloured matter having the form of eyeballs, and ever the globules broke and dripped down before the dais. And from the ice floor of the dome there ascended two masses like stalagmites, purple and dark as frozen gore, which had been made by the ceaseless dripping of the globules. Duni and Ux-Lodden prostrated themselves before the being, and Evark deemed it well to follow their example. Lying prone on the ice, he heard the red drops falling with a splash as of heavy tears, and then, in the dome above him, it seemed that a voice spoke, and the voice was like the sound of some hidden cataract in a glacier hollow with caverns. "Behold, O Ivar," said the voice, "I have preserved thee from the doom of thy fellow men, and have made thee as they that inhabit the bourne of coldness, and they that inhale the airless void. Wisdom ineffable shall be thine, and mastery beyond the conquest of mortals, if thou wilt but worship me and become my thrall. With me thou shalt voyage amid the kingdoms of the north, and shalt pass among the green southern islands, and see the white falling of death upon them in the light from Yikilth. Our coming shall bring eternal frost on their gardens, and shall set upon their people's flesh the seal of that gulf whose rigour paleth one by one the most ardent stars, and putteth rime at the core of suns. All this thou shalt witness, being as one of the lords of death, supernal and immortal, and in the end thou shalt return with me to that world beyond the uttermost pole, in which is mine abiding empire, for I am he whose coming even the gods may not oppose." Now, seeing that he was without choice in the matter, Eva professed himself willing to yield worship and service to the pale worm. Beneath the instruction of Duni and Ux-Lodden, he performed the sevenfold rite that is scarce suitable for narration here, and swore the threefold vow of unspeakable alienation. Thereafter, for many days and nights, he sailed with Relim Shakorth down the coast of Mu Thulan. Strange was the manner of that voyaging, for it seemed that the great iceberg was guided by the sorcery of the worm, prevailing ever against wind and tide, and always, by night or day, like the beams of a deathly beacon, the chill splendour smote afar from Yckelth. Proud galleys were overtaken as they fled southward, and their crews were blasted at the oars, and often ships were caught and embedded in the new bastions of ice that formed daily around the base of that ever-growing mountain. The fair Hyperborean ports, busy with maritime traffic, were stilled by the passing of Relim Shakorth. Idle were their streets and wharves, idle was the shipping in their harbours, when the pale light had come and gone. Far inland fell the rays, bringing to the fields and gardens a blight of transarctic winter, and forests were frozen and the beasts that roamed them were turned as if into marble, so that men who came long afterward to that region found the elk and bear and mammoth still standing in all the postures of life. But dwelling upon Yckelth, the sorcerer Evar was immune to the icy death, and sitting in his house or walking abroad on the berg, he was aware of no sharper cold than that which abides in summer shadows. Now, beside Duni and Uxlodden, the sorcerers of Thulask, there were 5 other wizards that went with Eva on that voyage, having been chosen by Relim Shakorth. They too had been tempered to the coldness by Yckelth, and their houses had been transported to the berg by unknown enchantment. They were outlandish and uncouth men, called Polarians, from islands nearer the pole than broad Thulask, and Eva could understand little of their ways, and their sorcery was foreign to him, and their speech was unintelligible, nor was it known to the Thulaskians. Daily the 8 wizards found on their tables all the provender necessary for human sustenance, though they knew not the agency by which it was supplied. All were united in the worship of the white worm, and all, it seemed, were content in a measure with their lot, and were fain of that unearthly law and dominion which the worm had promised them. But Ivar was uneasy at heart, and rebelled in secret against his thraldom to Relim Shakorth, and he beheld with revulsion the doom that went forth eternally from Yckelth upon lovely cities and fruitful ocean shores. Ruthfully he saw the blasting of flower-girdled Cerngoth, and the boreal stillness that descended on the thronged streets of Lekwan, and the frost that seared with sudden whiteness the garths and orchards of the sea-fronting valley of Aguil. And sorrow was in his heart for the fishing coracles and the byrams of trade and warfare that floated manless after they had met Yckelth. Ever southward sailed the great iceberg, bearing its lethal winter to lands where the summer sun rode high, and Ivar kept his own counsel, and followed in all ways the custom of Duni and Uxlodden and the others. At intervals that were regulated by the motions of the circumpolar stars, the 8 wizards climbed to that lofty chamber in which Relim Shakorth abode perpetually, half-coiled on his dais of ice. There, in a ritual whose cadences corresponded to the falling of those eye-like tears that were wept by the worm, and with genuflections timed to the yawning and shutting of his mouth, they yielded to Relim Shakorth the required adoration. Sometimes the worm was silent, and sometimes he bespoke them, renewing vaguely the promises he had made. And Eve learned from the others that the worm slept for a period at each darkening of the moon, and only at that time did the sanguine tears suspend their falling, and the mouth forbear its alternate closing and gaping. At the 3rd repetition of the rites of worship, it came to pass that only 7 wizards climbed to the tower. Evar, counting their number, perceived that the missing man was one of the 5 outlanders. Afterwards, he questioned Duni and Uxlodden regarding this matter, and made signs of inquiry to the 4 Northrens, but it seemed that the fate of the absent warlock was a thing mysterious to them all. Nothing was seen or heard of him from that time, and Eva, pondering long and deeply, was somewhat disquieted. For during the ceremony in the tower chamber, it had seemed to him that the worm was grosser of bulk and girth than on any prior occasion. Covertly he asked what manner of nutriment was required by Relim Shakorth. Concerning this, there was much dubiety and dispute, for Ubbo-Sathla maintained that the worm fed on nothing less unique than the hearts of white Arctic bears, while Dooney swore that his rightful nourishment was the liver of whales. But to their knowledge, the worm had not eaten during their sojourn upon Ycylth, and both averred that the intervals between his times of feeding were longer than those of any terrestrial creature, being computable not in hours or days, but in whole years. Still the iceberg followed its course, ever vaster and more prodigious beneath the heightening sun. And again, at the star-appointed time, which was the forenoon of every third day, the sorcerers convened in the presence of Relim Shekorth. To the perturbation of all, their number was now but 6, and the lost warlock was another of the outlanders. And the worm had greatened still more in size, and the increase was visible as a thickening of his whole body from head to tail. Deeming these circumstances an ill augury, the 6 made fearful supplication to the worm in their various tongues, and implored him to tell them the fate of their absent fellows. And the worm answered, and his speech was intelligible to Evar and Ubbo-Sathla and Dooney and the 3 Northrens, each thinking that he had been addressed in his native language. This matter is a mystery concerning which ye shall all receive enlightenment in turn. Know this, the 2 that have vanished are still present, and they and ye also shall share even as I have promised in the ultramundane law and empery of Relim Shekorth. Afterwards, when they had descended from the tower, Ivar and the 2 Thulaskians debated the interpretation of this answer. Ivar maintained that the import was sinister, for truly their missing companions were present only in the worm's belly, but the others argued that these men had undergone a more mystical translation and were now elevated beyond human sight and hearing. Forthwith they began to make ready with prayer and austerity, in expectation of some sublime apotheosis which would come to them in due turn. But Ivar was still fearful, and he could not trust the equivocal pledges of the worm, and doubt remained with him. Seeking to assuage his doubt and peradventure to find some trace of the lost Polarians, he made search of the mighty burg, on whose battlements his own house and the houses of the other warlocks were perched like the tiny huts of fishers on ocean cliffs. In this quest the others would not accompany him, fearing to incur the worm's displeasure. From verge to verge of Ycylth he roamed unhindered, as if on some broad plateau with peaks and horns, and he climbed perilously on the upper scarps, and went down into deep crevasses and caverns, where the sun failed, and there was no other light than the strange lustre of that unearthly ice. Embedded here in the walls, as if in the stone of nether strata, he saw dwellings such as men had never built, and vessels that might belong to other ages or worlds. But nowhere could he detect the presence of any living creature, and no spirit or shadow gave response to the necromantic evocations which he uttered oftentimes as he went along the chasms and chambers. So Ivar was still apprehensive of the worm's treachery, and he resolved to remain awake on the night preceding the next celebration of the rites of worship. And at eve of that night he assured himself that the other wizards were all housed in their separate mansions, to the number of 5. And having ascertained this, he set himself to watch without remission the entrance of Relim Shekorth's tower, which was plainly visible from his own windows. Weird and chill was the shining of the burg in the darkness, for a light as of frozen stars was effulgent at all times from the ice. A moon that was little past the full arose early on the Orient seas. But Ivar, holding vigil at his window till midnight, saw that no visible form emerged from the tall tower, and none entered it. At midnight there came upon him a sudden drowsiness, such as would be felt by one who had drunk some opiate wine, and he could not sustain his vigil any longer but slept deeply and unbrokenly throughout the remainder of the night. On the following day, there were but 4 sorcerers who gathered in the ice dome and gave homage to Relim Shekorth. And Ivar saw that 2 more of the outlanders, men of bulk and stature dwarfish beyond their fellows, were now missing. One by one thereafter, on nights preceding the ceremony of worship, the companions of Ivar vanished. The last Polarian was next to go, and it came to pass that only Ivar and Ubbo-Sathla and Dooney went to the tower, and then Ivar and Ubbo-Sathla went alone, and terror mounted daily in Ivar, for he felt that his own time drew near, and he would have hurled himself into the sea from the high ramparts of Ykilth if Ubbo-Sathla, who perceived his intention, had not warned him that no man could depart therefrom and live again in solar warmth and terrene air, having been habituated to the coldness and thin ether. And Ubbo-Sathla, it seemed, was wholly oblivious to his doom, and was fain to impute an esoteric significance to the ever-growing bulk of the white worm and the vanishing of the wizards. So, at that time when the moon had waned and darkened wholly, it occurred that Ivar climbed before Relim Shakorth with infinite trepidation and loath, laggard steps. And entering the dome with downcast eyes, he found himself to be the sole worshipper. A palsy of fear was upon him as he made obeisance, and scarcely he dared to lift his eyes and regard the worm. But even as he began to perform the customary genuflections, he became aware that the red tears of Relim Shakorth no longer fell on the purple stalagmites, nor was there any sound such as the worm was wont to make by the perpetual opening and shutting of his mouth, and venturing at last to look upward, Ivar beheld the abhorrently swollen mass of the monster, whose thickness was such as to overhang the dais rim, and he saw that the mouth and eye holes of Relim Shakorth were closed as if in slumber, and thereupon he recalled how the wizards of Thulask had told him that the worm slept for an interval at the darkening of each moon, which was a thing he had forgotten temporarily in his extreme dread and apprehension. Now was Ivar sorely bewildered, for the rites he had learned from his fellows could be fittingly performed only while the tears of Relim Shakorth fell down, and his mouth gaped and closed and gaped again in measured alternation. And none had instructed him as to what rites were proper and suitable during the slumber of the worm. And being in much doubt, he said softly, "Wakest thou, O Relim Shakorth?" In reply, he seemed to hear a multitude of voices that issued obscurely from out the pale, tumid mass before him. The sound of the voices was weirdly muffled, but among them he distinguished the accents of Duni and Ubbo-Sathla, and there was a thick muttering of outlandish words which Ivar knew for the speech of the 5 Polarians. And beneath this he caught, or seemed to catch, innumerable undertones that were not the voices of men or beasts, nor such sounds as would be emitted by earthly demons. And the voices rose and clamoured, like those of a throng of prisoners in some profound oubliette. Anon, as he listened in horror ineffable, the voice of Duni became articulate above the others, and the manifold clamour and muttering ceased, as if a multitude were hushed to hear its own spokesman. And Ivar heard the tones of Duni saying, "The worm sleepeth, but we whom the worm hath devoured are awake. Direly has he deceived us, for he came to our houses in the night, devouring us bodily one by one as we slept under the enchantment he had wrought. He has eaten our souls even as our bodies, and verily we are part of Relim Shakorth, but exist only as in a dark and noisome dungeon, and while the worm wakes we have no separate or conscious being, but are merged wholly in the ultra-terrestrial being of Relim Shakorth. Hear then, O Ivar, the truth we have learned from our oneness with the worm. He has saved us from the white doom and has taken us upon Ykilth for this reason, because we alone of all mankind, who are sorcerers of high attainment and mastery, may endure the lethal ice change and become breathers of the airless void, and thus in the end be made suitable for the provender of such as Relim Shakorth. Great and terrible is the worm, and the place wherefrom he cometh and whereto he returneth is not to be dreamt of by living men. And the worm is omniscient, save that he knows not the waking of them he has devoured, and their awareness during his slumber. But the worm, though ancient beyond the antiquity of worlds, is not immortal and is vulnerable in one particular. Whosoever learneth the time and means of his vulnerability and hath heart for this undertaking, may slay him easily. And the time for the deed is during his term of sleep. Therefore we adjure thee now by the faith of the old ones to draw the sword thou wearest beneath thy mantle and plunge it in the side of Relim Shakorth, for such is the means of his slaying. Thus alone, O Ivar, shall the going forth of the pale death be ended, and only thus shall we, thy fellow sorcerers, obtain release from our blind thraldom and incarceration, and with us many that the worm hath betrayed and eaten in former ages, and upon distant worlds. And only by the doing of this thing shalt thou escape the wan and loathly mouth of the worm, nor abide henceforward as a doubtful ghost among other ghosts in the evil blackness of his belly. But know, however, that he who slayeth Relim Shakorth must necessarily perish in the slaying. Ivark, being wholly astounded, made question of Dooney, and was answered readily concerning all that he asked, and oftentimes the voice of Oxlodden replied to him, and sometimes there were unintelligible murmurs as outcries from certain others of those foully immued phantoms. Much did Eve learn of the worm's origin and essence, and he was told the secret of Yikilth, and the manner wherein Yikilth had floated down from trans-Arctic gulfs to voyage the seas of earth. Ever, as he listened, his abhorrence greatened, though deeds of dark sorcery and conjured devils had long indurated his flesh and soul, making him callous to more than common horrors. But of that which he learned it were ill to speak now. At length there was silence in the dome, for the worm slept soundly, and Ivar had no longer any will to question the ghost of Dooney, and they that were imprisoned with Dooney seemed to wait and watch in a stillness of death. Then, being a man of much hardihood and resolution, Ivar delayed no more but drew from its ivory sheath the short but well-tempered sword of bronze, which he carried always at his baldric. Approaching the dais closely, he plunged the blade in the overswelling mass of Relim Shakorth. The blade entered easily, with a slicing and tearing motion, as if he had stabbed a monstrous bladder, and was not stayed even by the broad pommel, and the whole right hand of Ivar was drawn after it into the wound. He perceived no quiver or stirring of the worm, but out of the wound there gushed a sudden torrent of black liquescent matter, swiftning and deepening irresistibly till the sword was caught from Ive's grasp as if in a mill race. Hotter far than blood, and smoking with strange steam-like vapours, the liquid poured over his arms and splashed his raiment as it fell. Quickly the ice was awash about his feet, but still the fluid welled as if from some inexhaustible spring of foulness, and it spread everywhere in pools and runlets that came together. Ivar would have fled then, but the sable liquid, mounting and flowing, was above his ankles when he neared the stairhead, and it rushed adown the stairway before him like a cataract in some steeply pitching cavern. Hotter and hotter it grew, boiling, bubbling, while the current strengthened, and clutched at him and drew him like malignant hands. He feared to essay the downward stairs, nor was there any place now in all the dome where he could climb for refuge. He turned, striving against the tide for bare foothold, and saw dimly through the reeking vapours the throned mass of Relim Shakorth. The gash had widened prodigiously, and a stream surged from it like the waters of a broken weir, billowing outward around the dais, and yet, as if in further proof of the worm's unearthly nature, his bulk was in no wise diminished thereby, and still the black liquid came in an evil flood, and it rose swirling about the knees of Ivar, and the vapours seemed to take the forms of a myriad press of phantoms, wreathing obscurely together and dividing once more as they went past him. Then, as he tottered and grew giddy on the stairhead, he was swept away and was hurled to his death on the ice steps far below. That day, on the sea to eastward of Middle Hyperborea, the crews of certain merchant galleys beheld an unheard-of thing, for lo, as they sped north returning from far ocean isles with a wind that aided their oars, they sighted in the late forenoon a monstrous iceberg whose pinnacles and crags loomed high as mountains. The berg shone in part with a weird light, and from its loftiest pinnacle poured an ink-black torrent, and all the ice cliffs and buttresses beneath were astream with rapids and cascades and sheeted falls of the same blackness that fumed like boiling water as they plunged oceanward, and the sea around the iceberg was clouded and streaked for a wide interval, as if with the dark fluid of the cuttlefish. The mariners feared to sail closer, but full of awe and marvelling, they stayed their oars and lay watching the berg, and the wind dropped, so that their galleys drifted within view of it all that day. They saw that the berg dwindled swiftly, melting as though some unknown fire consumed it, and the air took on a strange warmth, and the water about their ships grew tepid. Crag by crag the ice was runnelled and eaten away, and huge portions fell off with a mighty splashing, and the highest pinnacle collapsed. But still the blackness poured out as from an unfathomable fountain. The mariners thought, at whiles, that they beheld houses running seaward amid the loosened fragments, but of this they were uncertain because of those ever-mounting vapours. By sunset time the berg had diminished to a mass no larger than a common floe, yet still the welling blackness overstreamed it, and it sank low in the wave, and the weird light was quenched altogether. Thereafter, the night being moonless, it was lost to vision, and a gale rose, blowing strongly from the south, and at dawn the sea was void of any remnant. Concerning the matters related above, many and various legends have gone forth throughout Mu Thulan and all the extreme hyperboreal kingdoms and archipelagos, even to the southmost isle of Ostror. The truth is not in such tales, for no man has known the truth heretofore. But I, the sorcerer Ibon, calling up through my necromancy the wave-wandering spectre of Ivar, have learned from him the veritable history of the worm's advent, and I have written it down in my volume with such omissions as are needful for the sparing of mortal weakness and sanity. And men will read this record, together with much more of the elder lore in days long after the coming and melting of the great glacier.
The Nameless Offspring by Clark Ashton Smith. Many and multiform are the dim horrors of earth, infesting her ways from the prime. They sleep beneath the unturned stone. They rise with the tree from its roots. They move beneath the sea and in subterranean places. They dwell in the inmost Adaita. They emerge betimes from the shut-in sepulchre of haughty bronze and the low grave that is sealed with clay. There be some that are long known to man, and others as yet unknown that abide the terrible latter days of their revealing. Those which are the most dreadful and the loathliest of all are haply still to be declared. But among those that have revealed themselves aforetime, and have made manifest their veritable presence, there is one which may not openly be named for its exceeding foulness. It is that spawn which the hidden dweller in the vaults has begotten upon mortality, from the Necronomicon of Abdul al-Hazred. In a sense, it is fortunate that the story I must now relate should be so largely a thing of undetermined shadows, of half-shaped hints and forbidden inferences. Otherwise it could never be written by human hand or read by human eye. My own slight part in the hideous drama was limited to its last act, and to me its earlier scenes were merely a remote and ghastly legend. Yet even so, the broken reflex of its unnatural horrors has crowded out in perspective the main events of normal life, has made them seem no more than frail gossamers, woven on the dark, windy verge of some unsealed abyss, some deep, half-open charnel, wherein earth's nethermost corruptions lurk and fester. The legend of which I speak was familiar to me from childhood, as a theme of family whispers and headshakings, for Sir John Tremeth had been a schoolmate of my father. But I had never met Sir John, had never visited Tremeth Hall, till the time of those happenings which formed the final tragedy. My father had taken me from England to Canada when I was a small infant. He had prospered in Manitoba as an apiarist, and after his death the bee ranch had kept me too busy for years to execute a long-cherished dream of visiting my natal land and exploring its rural byways. When finally I set sail, the story was pretty dim in my memory, and Tremeth Hall was no conscious part of my itinerary when I began a motorcycle tour of the English counties. In any case, I should never have been drawn to the neighborhood out of morbid curiosity, such as the frightful tale might possibly have evoked in others. My visit, as it happened, was purely accidental. I had forgotten the exact location of the place, and did not even dream that I was in its vicinity. If I had known, it seems to me that I should have turned aside, in spite of the circumstances that impelled me to seek shelter, rather than intrude upon the almost demoniacal misery of its owner. When I came to Tremeth Hall, I had ridden all day in early autumn, through a rolling countryside with leisurely winding thoroughfares and lanes. The day had been fair, with skies of pale azure above noble parks that were tinged with the first amber and crimson of the following year. But toward the middle of the afternoon, a mist had come in from the hidden ocean across low hills, and had closed me about with its moving phantom circle. Somehow, in that deceptive fog, I managed to lose my way, to miss the milepost that would have given me my direction to the town where I had planned to spend the ensuing night. I went on for a while at random, thinking that I should soon reach another crossroad. The way that I followed was little more than a rough lane and was singularly deserted. The fog had darkened and drawn closer, obliterating all horizons. But from what I could see of it, the country was one of heath and boulders, with no sign of cultivation. I topped a level ridge and went down a long, monotonous slope as the mist continued to thicken with twilight. I thought that I was riding toward the west, but before me, in the wan dusk, there was no faintest gleaming or flare of color to betoken the drowned sunset. A dank odor that was touched with salt, like the smell of sea marshes, came to meet me. The road turned at a sharp angle, and I seemed to be riding between downs and marshland. The night gathered with an almost unnatural quickness, as if in haste to overtake me, and I began to feel a sort of dim concern and alarm, as if I had gone astray in regions that were more dubious than an English county. The fog and twilight seemed to withhold a silent landscape of chill, deathly, disquieting mystery. Then, to the left of my road and a little before me, I saw a light that somehow suggested a mournful and tear-dimmed eye. It shone among blurred, uncertain masses that were like trees from a ghostland wood. A nearer mass, as I approached it, was resolved into a small lodge building, such as would guard the entrance of some estate. It was dark and apparently unoccupied. Pausing and peering, I saw the outlines of a wrought iron gate in a hedge of untrimmed yew. It all had a desolate and forbidding air, and I felt in my very marrow the brooding chillness that had come in from the unseen marsh in that dismal, ever-coiling fog. But the light was promise of human nearness on the lonely downs, and I might obtain shelter for the night, or at least find someone who could direct me to a town or inn. Somewhat to my surprise, the gate was unlocked. It swung inward with a rusty grating sound, as if it had not been opened for a long time, and pushing my motorcycle before me, I followed a weed-grown drive toward the light. The rambling mass of a large manor house disclosed itself, among trees and shrubs whose artificial forms, like the hedge of ragged yew, were assuming a wilder grotesquerie than they had received from the hand of the topiary. The fog had turned into a bleak drizzle. Almost groping in the gloom, I found a dark door at some distance from the window that gave forth the solitary light. In response to my thrice-repeated knock, I heard at length the muffled sound of slow, dragging footfalls. The door was opened with a gradualness that seemed to indicate caution or reluctance, and I saw before me an old man, bearing a lighted taper in his hand. His fingers trembled with palsy or decrepitude, and monstrous shadows flickered behind him in a dim hallway, and touched his wrinkled features as with the flitting of ominous bat-like wings.
"What do you wish, sir?"
he asked. The voice, though quavering and hesitant, was far from churlish and did not suggest the attitude of suspicion and downright inhospitality which I had begun to apprehend. However, I sensed a sort of irresolution or dubiety, and as the old man listened to my account of the circumstances that had led me to knock at that lonely door, I saw that he was scrutinizing me with a keenness that belied my first impression of extreme senility.
"I knew you were a stranger in these parts,"
he commented when I had finished.
"But might I inquire your name, sir?"
"I am Henry Chaldane."
"Are you not the son of Mr. Arthur Chaldane?"
Somewhat mystified, I admitted the ascribed paternity.
"You resemble your father, sir. Mr. Chaldane and Sir John Tremeth were great friends in the days before your father went to Canada. Will you not come in, sir? This is Tremeth Hall. Sir John has not been in the habit of receiving guests for a long time, but I shall tell him that you are here, and it may be that he will wish to see you."
Startled, and not altogether agreeably surprised at the discovery of my whereabouts, I followed the old man to a book-lined study whose furnishings bore evidence of luxury and neglect. Here he lit an oil lamp of antique fashion with a dusty painted shade, and left me alone with the dustier volumes and furniture. I felt a queer embarrassment, a sense of actual intrusion, as I waited in the wan yellow lamplight. There came back to me the details of the strange, horrific, half-forgotten story I had overheard from my father in childhood years. Lady Agatha Tremeth, Sir John's wife, in the first year of their marriage, had become the victim of cataleptic seizures. The third seizure had apparently terminated in death, for she did not revive after the usual interval, and displayed all the familiar marks of the rigor mortis. Lady Agatha's body was placed in the family vaults, which were of almost fabulous age and extent, and had been excavated in the hill behind the manor house. On the day following the interment, Sir John, troubled by a queer, insistent doubt as to the finality of the medical verdict, had re-entered the vaults in time to hear a wild cry, and had found Lady Agatha sitting up in her coffin. The nailed lid was lying on the stone floor, and it seemed impossible that it could have been removed by the struggles of the frail woman. However, there was no other plausible explanation, though Lady Agatha herself could throw little light on the circumstances of her strange resurrection. Half-dazed and almost delirious, in a state of dire terror that was easily understandable, she told an incoherent tale of her experience. She did not seem to remember struggling to free herself from the coffin, but was troubled mainly by recollections of a pale, hideous, unhuman face, which she had seen in the gloom on awakening from her prolonged and death-like sleep. It was the sight of this face, stooping over her as she lay in the open coffin, that had caused her to cry out so wildly. The thing had vanished before Sir John's approach, fleeing swiftly to the inner vaults, and she had formed only a vague idea of its bodily appearance. She thought, however, that it was large and white, and ran like an animal on all fours, though its limbs were semi-human. Of course, her tale was regarded as a sort of dream, or a figment of delirium induced by the awful shock of her experience, which had blotted out all recollection of its true terror. But the memory of the horrible face and figure had seemed to obsess her permanently, and was plainly fraught with associations of mind-unhinging fear. She did not recover from her illness, but lived on in a shattered condition of brain and body, and 9 months later she died, after giving birth to her first child. Her death was a merciful thing, for the child, it seemed, was one of those appalling monsters that sometimes appear in human families. The exact nature of its abnormality was not known, though frightful and divergent rumors had purported to emanate from the doctor, nurses, and servants who had seen it. Some of the latter had left Tremouth Hall and had refused to return after a single glimpse of the monstrosity. After Lady Agatha's death, Sir John had withdrawn from society, and little or nothing was divulged in regard to his doings or the fate of the horrible infant. People said, however, that the child was kept in a locked room with iron-barred windows, which no one but Sir John himself ever entered. The tragedy had blighted his whole life, and he had become a recluse, living alone with 1 or 2 faithful servants and allowing his estate to decline grievously through neglect. Doubtless, I thought, the old man who had admitted me was one of the remaining servitors. I was still reviewing the dreadful legend, still striving to recollect certain particulars that had almost passed from memory, when I heard the sound of footsteps which, from their slowness and feebleness, I took to be those of the returning manservant. However, I was mistaken, for the person who entered was plainly Sir John Tremouth himself. The tall, slightly bent figure, the face that was lined as if by the trickling of some corrosive acid, were marked with a dignity that seemed to triumph over the double ravages of mortal sorrow and illness. Somehow, though I could have calculated his real age, I had expected an old man, but he was scarcely beyond middle life. His cadaverous pallor and feeble tottering walk were those of a man who is stricken with some fatal malady. His manner, as he addressed me, was impeccably courteous and even gracious, but the voice was that of one to whom the ordinary relations and actions of life had long since become meaningless and perfunctory.
Harper tells me that you are the son of my old school friend, Arthur Chaldane. I bid you welcome to such poor hospitality as I am able to offer. I have not received guests for many years, and I fear you will find the hall pretty dull and dismal, and will think me an indifferent host. Nevertheless, you must remain, at least for the night. Harper has gone to prepare dinner for us.
You are very kind. I fear, however, that I am intruding, if—
Not at all. You must be my guest. It is miles to the nearest inn, and the fog is changing into a heavy rain. Indeed, I am glad to have you. You must tell me all about your father and yourself at dinner. In the meanwhile, I'll try to find a room for you, if you'll come with me.
He led me to the second floor of the manor house and down a long hall with beams and panels of ancient oak. We passed several doors which were doubtless those of bedchambers. All were closed, and one of the doors was reinforced with iron bars, heavy and sinister as those of a dungeon cell. Inevitably, I surmised that this was the chamber in which the monstrous child had been confined, and also I wondered if the abnormality still lived, after a lapse of time that must have been nearly 30 years. How abysmal, how abhorrent, must have been its departure from the human type, to necessitate an immediate removal from the sight of others. And what characteristics of its further development could have rendered necessary the massive bars on an oaken door which, by itself, was strong enough to have resisted the assaults of any common man or beast? Without even glancing at the door, my host went on, carrying a taper that scarcely shook in his feeble fingers. My curious reflections as I followed him were interrupted with nerve-shattering suddenness by a loud cry that seemed to issue from the barred room. The sound was a long, ever-mounting ululation, infrabass at first like the tomb-muffled voice of a demon, and rising through abominable degrees to a shrill, ravenous fury, as if the demon had emerged by a series of underground steps to the open air. It was neither human nor bestial. It was wholly preternatural, hellish, macabre, and I shuddered with an insupportable eeriness that still persisted when the demon voice, after reaching its culmination, had returned by reverse degrees to a profound sepulchral silence. Sir John had given no apparent heed to the awful sound, but had gone on with no more than his usual faltering. He had reached the end of the hall, and was pausing before the second chamber from the one with the sealed door.
"I'll let you have this room. It's just beyond the one that I occupy."
He did not turn his face toward me as he spoke, and his voice was unnaturally toneless and restrained. I realized with another shudder that the chamber he had indicated as his own was adjacent to the room from which the frightful ululation had appeared to issue. The chamber to which he now admitted me had manifestly not been used for years. The air was chill, stagnant, unwholesome, with an all-pervading mustiness, and the antique furniture had gathered the inevitable increment of dust and cobwebs. Sir John began to apologize.
"I didn't realize the condition of the room. I'll send Harper after dinner to do a little dusting and clearing and put fresh linen on the bed."
I protested rather vaguely that there was no need for him to apologize. The unhuman loneliness and decay of the old manor house, its lustrums and decades of neglect, and the corresponding desolation of its owner, had impressed me more painfully than ever, and I dared not speculate overmuch concerning the ghastly secret of the barred chamber, and the hellish howling that still echoed in my shaken nerves. Already I regretted the singular fortuity that had drawn me to that place of evil and festering shadows. I felt an urgent desire to leave, to continue my journey even in the face of the bleak autumnal rain and wind-blown darkness. But I could think of no excuse that would be sufficiently tangible and valid. Manifestly there was nothing to do but remain. Our dinner was served in a dismal but stately room, by the old man whom Sir John had referred to as Harper. The meal was plain but substantial and well cooked, and the service was impeccable. I had begun to infer that Harper was the only servant, a combination of valet, butler, housekeeper, and chef. In spite of my hunger and the pains taken by my host to make me feel at ease, the meal was a solemn and almost funereal ceremony. I could not forget my father's story, and still less could I forget the sealed door and the baleful ululation. Whatever it was, the monstrosity still lived, and I felt a complex mingling of admiration, pity, and horror as I looked at the gaunt and gallant face of Sir John Tremeth, and reflected upon the lifelong hell to which he had been condemned, and the apparent fortitude with which he had borne its unthinkable ordeals. A bottle of excellent sherry was brought in. Over this we sat for an hour or more. Sir John spoke at some length concerning my father, of whose death he had not previously heard, and he drew me out in regard to my own affairs with the subtle adroitness of a polished man of the world. He said little about himself, and not even by hint or implication did he refer to the tragic history which I have outlined. Since I am rather abstemious and did not empty my glass with much frequency, the major part of the heavy wine was consumed by my host. Toward the end it seemed to bring out in him a curious vein of confidentiality, and he spoke for the first time of the ill health, that was all too patent in his appearance. I learned that he was subject to that most painful form of heart disease, angina pectoris, and had recently recovered from an attack of unusual severity.
The next one will finish me, and it may come at any time, perhaps tonight.
He made the announcement very simply, as if he were voicing a commonplace or venturing a prediction about the weather. Then, after a slight pause, he went on, with more emphasis and weightiness of tone.
Maybe you'll think me queer, but I have a fixed prejudice against burial or vault interment. I want my remains to be thoroughly cremated, and have left careful directions to that end. Harper will see to it that they are fulfilled. Fire is the cleanest and purest of the elements, and it cuts short all the damnable processes between death and ultimate disintegration. I can't bear the idea of some mouldy, worm-infested tomb.
He continued to discourse on the subject for some time, with a singular elaboration and tenseness of manner that showed it to be a familiar theme of thought, if not an actual obsession. It seemed to possess a morbid fascination for him, and there was a painful light in his hollow, haunted eyes, and a touch of rigidly subdued hysteria in his voice as he spoke. I remembered the interment of Lady Agatha, and her tragic resurrection, and the dim, delirious horror of the vaults that had formed an inexplicable and vaguely disturbing part of her story. It was not hard to understand Sir John's aversion to burial, but I was far from suspecting the full terror and ghastliness on which his repugnance had been founded. Harper had disappeared after bringing the sherry, and I surmised that he had been given orders for the renovation of my room. We had now drained our last glasses, and my host had ended his peroration. The wind, which had animated him briefly, seemed to die out, and he looked more ill and haggard than ever. Pleading my own fatigue, I expressed a wish to retire, and he, with his invariable courtliness, insisted on seeing me to my chamber and making sure of my comfort before seeking his own bed. In the hall above, we met Harper, who was just descending from a flight of stairs that must have led to an attic or third floor. He was carrying a heavy iron pan, in which a few scraps of meat remained, and I caught an odor of pronounced gaminess, almost virtual putrescence, from the pan as he went by. I wondered if he had been feeding the unknown monstrosity, and if perhaps its food were supplied to it through a trap in the ceiling of the barred room. The surmise was reasonable enough, but the odor of the scraps, by a train of remote half-literary association, had begun to suggest other surmises which, it would seem, were beyond the realm of possibility and reason. Certain evasive, incoherent hints appeared to point themselves suddenly to an atrocious and abhorrent whole. With imperfect success, I assured myself that the thing I had fancied was incredible to science was a mere creation of superstitious diablerie. No, it could not be. Here in England, of all places, that corpse-devouring demon of Oriental tales and legends, the ghoul. Contrary to my fears, there was no repetition of the fiendish howling as we passed the secret room, but I thought that I heard a measured crunching, such as a large animal would make in devouring its food. My room, though still drear and dismal enough, had been cleared of its accumulated dust and matted gossamers. After a personal inspection, Sir John left me and retired to his own chamber. I was struck by his deathly pallor and weakness, as he said good night to me, and felt guiltily apprehensive that the strain of receiving and entertaining a guest might have aggravated the dire disease from which he suffered. I seemed to detect actual pain and torment beneath his careful armor of urbanity, and wondered if the urbanity had not been maintained at an excessive cost. The fatigue of my day-long journey, together with the heavy wine I had drunk, should have conduced to early slumber. But though I lay with tightly closed lids in the darkness, I could not dismiss those evil shadows, those black and charnel larvae that swarmed upon me from the ancient house. Insufferable and forbidden things besieged me with filthy talons, brushed me with noisome coils, as I tossed through eternal hours and lay staring at the gray square of the storm-darkened window. The dripping of the rain, the sough and moan of the wind, resolved themselves to a dread mutter of half-articulate voices that plotted against my peace and whispered loathfully of nameless secrets in demonian language. At length, after the seeming lapse of nocturnal centuries, the tempest died away, and I no longer heard the equivocal voices. The window lightened a little in the black wall, and the terrors of my night-long insomnia seemed to withdraw partially, but without bringing the surcease of slumber. I became aware of utter silence, and then, in the silence, of a queer, faint, disquieting sound whose cause and location baffled me for many minutes. The sound was muffled and far off at times. Then it seemed to draw near, as if it were in the next room. I began to identify it as a sort of scratching, such as would be made by the claws of an animal on solid woodwork. Sitting up in bed and listening attentively, I realized with a fresh start of horror that it came from the direction of the barred chamber. It took on a strange resonance, then it became almost inaudible, and suddenly for a while it ceased. In the interim I heard a groan, like that of a man in great agony or terror. I could not mistake the source of the groan, which had issued from Sir John Tremouth's room, nor was I doubtful any longer as to the causation of the scratching. The groan was not repeated, but the damnable clawing sound began again, and was continued till daybreak. Then, as if the creature that had caused the noise were wholly nocturnal in its habits, the faint, vibrant rasping ceased and was not resumed. In a state of dull, nightmarish apprehension, drugged with weariness and want of sleep, I had listened to it with intolerably straining ears. With its cessation, in the hueless, livid dawn, I slid into a deep slumber, from which the muffled and amorphous spectres of the old hall were unable to detain me any longer. I was awakened by a loud knocking on my door, a knocking in which even my sleep-confused senses could recognize the imperative and urgent. It must have been close upon midday, and feeling guilty at having overslept so egregiously, I ran to the door and opened it. The old manservant Harper was standing without, and his tremulous, grief-broken manner told me before he spoke that something of dire import had occurred.
I regret to tell you, Mr. Chaldane, that Sir John is dead. He did not answer my knock as usual, so I made bold to enter his room. He must have died early this morning.
Inexpressibly shocked by his announcement, I recalled the single groan I had heard in the gray beginning of dawn. My host, perhaps, had been dying at that very moment. I recalled, too, the detestable nightmare scratching. Unavoidably, I wondered if the groan had been occasioned by fear as well as by physical pain. Had the strain and suspense of listening to that hideous sound brought on the final paroxysm of Sir John's malady? I could not be sure of the truth, but my brain seethed with awful and ghastly conjectures. With the futile formalities that one employs on such occasions, I tried to condole with the aged servant, and offered him such assistance as I could in making the necessary arrangements for the disposition of his master's remains. Since there was no telephone in the house, I volunteered to find a doctor who would examine the body and sign the death certificate. The old man seemed to feel a singular relief and gratitude.
Thank you, sir. I don't want to leave Sir John. I promised him that I'd keep a close watch over his body.
He went on to speak of Sir John's desire for cremation. It seemed that the baronet had left explicit directions for the building of a pyre of driftwood on the hill behind the hall, the burning of his remains on this pyre, and the sowing of his ashes on the fields of the estate. These directions he had enjoined and empowered the servant to carry out as soon after death as possible. No one was to be present at the ceremony, except Harper and the hired pallbearers, and Sir John's nearer relatives, none of whom lived in the vicinity, were not to be informed of his demise till all was over. I refused Harper's offer to prepare my breakfast, telling him that I could obtain a meal in the neighboring village. There was a strange uneasiness in his manner, and I realized, with thoughts and emotions not to be specified in this narrative, that he was anxious to begin his promised vigil beside Sir John's corpse. It would be tedious and unnecessary to detail the funereal afternoon that followed. The heavy sea fog had returned, and I seemed to grope my way through a sodden but unreal world as I sought the nearby town. I succeeded in locating a doctor and also in securing several men to build the pyre and act as pallbearers. I was met everywhere with an odd taciturnity, and no one seemed willing to comment on Sir John's death or to speak of the dark legendary that was attached to Tremouth Hall. Harper, to my amazement, had proposed that the cremation should take place at once. This, however, proved to be impracticable. When all the formalities and arrangements had been completed, The fog turned into a steady, everlasting downpour, which rendered impossible the lighting of the pyre, and we were compelled to defer the ceremony. I had promised Harper that I should remain at the hall till all was done, and so it was that I spent a second night beneath that roof of accursed and abominable secrets. The darkness came on betimes. After a last visit to the village, in which I procured some sandwiches for Harper and myself in lieu of dinner, I returned to the lonely hall. I was met by Harper on the stairs, as I ascended to the death chamber. There was an increased agitation in his manner, as if something had happened to frighten him.
I wonder if you'd keep me company tonight, Mr. Chaldane. It's a gruesome watch that I'm asking you to share, and it may be a dangerous one. But Sir John would thank you, I am sure. If you have a weapon of any sort, it will be well to bring it with you.
It was impossible to refuse his request, and I assented at once. I was unarmed, so Harper insisted on equipping me with an antique revolver, of which he himself carried the mate. "Look here, Harper," I said bluntly as we followed the hall to Sir John's chamber. "What are you afraid of?" He flinched visibly at the question and seemed unwilling to answer. Then after a moment he appeared to realize that frankness was necessary.
It's the thing in the barred room. You must have heard it, sir. We've had the care of it, Sir John and I, these 28 years, and we've always feared that it might break out. It never gave us much trouble, as long as we kept it well fed. But for the last 3 nights, it has been scratching at the thick oaken wall of Sir John's chamber, which is something it never did before. Sir John thought it knew that he was going to die, and that it wanted to reach his body, being hungry for other food than we had given it. That's why we must guard him closely tonight, Mr. Chaldane. I pray to God that the wall will hold, but the thing keeps on clawing and clawing like a demon, and I don't like the hollowness of the sound, as if the wall were getting pretty thin.
Appalled by this confirmation of my own most repugnant surmise, I could offer no rejoinder, since all comment would have been futile. With Harper's open avowal, the abnormality took on a darker and more encroaching shadow, a more potent and tyrannic menace. Willingly would I have foregone the promised vigil, but this, of course, it was impossible to do. The bestial, diabolic scratching, louder and more frantic than before, assailed my ears as we passed the barred room. All too readily I understood the nameless fear that had impelled the old man to request my company. The sound was inexpressibly alarming and nerve-sapping, with its grim, macabre insistence, its intimation of ghoulish hunger. It became even plainer, with a hideous, tearing vibrancy, when we entered the room of death. During the whole course of that funereal day, I had refrained from visiting this chamber, since I am lacking in the morbid curiosity which impels many to gaze upon the dead. So it was that I beheld my host for the second and last time. Fully dressed and prepared for the pyre, he lay on the chill white bed whose heavily figured arras-like curtains had been drawn back. The room was lit by several tall tapers, arranged on a little table in curious brazen candelabras that were greened with antiquity. But the light seemed to afford only a doubtful, dolorous glimmering in the drear spaciousness and mortuary shadows. Somewhat against my will, I gazed on the dead features and averted my eyes very hastily. I was prepared for the stony pallor and rigor, but not for the full betrayal of that hideous revulsion, that inhuman terror and horror, which must have corroded the man's heart through infernal years, and which, with almost superhuman control, he had masked from the casual beholder in life. The revelation was too painful, and I could not look at him again. In a sense, it seemed that he was not dead, that he was still listening with agonized attention to the dreadful sounds that might well have served to precipitate the final attack of his malady. There were several chairs, dating, I think, like the bed itself, from the 17th century. Harper and I seated ourselves near the small table and between the deathbed and the paneled wall of blackish wood from which the ceaseless clawing sound appeared to issue. In tacit silence, with drawn and cocked revolvers, we began our ghastly vigil. As we sat and waited, I was driven to picture the unnamed monstrosity, and formless or half-formed images of charnel nightmare pursued each other in chaotic succession through my mind. An atrocious curiosity, to which I should normally have been a stranger, prompted me to question Harper, but I was restrained by an even more powerful inhibition. On his part, the old man volunteered no information or comment whatever, but watched the wall with fear-bright eyes that did not seem to waver in his palsy-nodding head. It would be impossible to convey the unnatural tension, the macabre suspense and baleful expectation of the hours that followed. The woodwork must have been of great thickness and hardness, such as would have defied the assaults of any normal creature equipped only with talons or teeth. But in spite of such obvious arguments as these, I thought momentarily to see it crumble inward. The scratching noise went on eternally, and to my febrile fancy it grew sharper and nearer every instant. At recurrent intervals I seemed to hear a low, eager, dog-like whining, such as a ravenous animal would make when it neared the goal of its burrowing. Neither of us had spoken of what we should do in case the monster should attain its objective, but there seemed to be an unvoiced agreement. However, with a superstitiousness of which I should not have believed myself capable, I began to wonder if the monster possessed enough of humanity in its composition to be vulnerable to mere revolver bullets. To what extent would it display the traits of its unknown and fabulous paternity? I tried to convince myself that such questions and wonderings were patently absurd, but was drawn to them again and again, as if by the allurement of some forbidden gulf. The night wore on, like the flowing of a dark, sluggish stream, and the tall funeral tapers had burned to within an inch of their verdigris-eaten sockets. It was this circumstance alone that gave me an idea of the passage of time, for I seemed to be drowning in a black eternity, motionless beneath the crawling and seething of blind horrors. I had grown so accustomed to the clawing noise in the woodwork, and the sound had gone on so long, that I deemed its ever-growing sharpness and hollowness a mere hallucination, and so it was that the end of our vigil came without apparent warning. Suddenly, as I stared at the wall and listened with frozen fixity, I heard a harsh, splintering sound, and saw that a narrow strip had broken loose and was hanging from the panel. Then, before I could collect myself or credit the awful witness of my senses, a large semicircular portion of the wall collapsed in many splinters beneath the impact of some ponderous body. Mercifully, perhaps, I have never been able to recall with any degree of distinctness the hellish thing that issued from the panel. The visual shock, by its own excess of horror, has almost blotted the details from memory. I have, however, the blurred impression of a huge, whitish, hairless, and semi-quadruped body, of canine teeth and a half-human face, and long hyena nails at the end of forelimbs that were both arms and legs. A charnel stench preceded the apparition, like a breath from the den of some carrion-eating animal, and then with a single nightmare leap, the thing was upon us. I heard the staccato crack of Harper's revolver, sharp and vengeful in the closed room, but there was only a rusty click from my own weapon. Perhaps the cartridge was too old. Any rate, it had misfired. Before I could press the trigger again, I was hurled to the floor with terrific violence, striking my head against the heavy base of the little table. A black curtain, spangled with countless fires, appeared to fall upon me and to blot the room from sight. Then all the fires went out, and there was only darkness. Again, slowly, I became conscious of flame and shadow, but the flame was bright and flickering, and seemed to grow ever more brilliant. Then my dull, doubtful senses were sharply revived and clarified by the acrid odor of burning cloth. The features of the room returned to vision, and I found that I was lying huddled against the overthrown table, gazing toward the deathbed. The guttering candles had been hurled to the floor. One of them was eating a slow circle of fire in the carpet beside me, and another, spreading, had ignited the bed curtains, which were flaring swiftly upward to the great canopy. Even as I lay staring, huge, ruddy tatters of the burning fabric fell upon the bed in a dozen places, and the body of Sir John Tremeth was ringed about with starting flames. I staggered heavily to my feet, dazed and giddy with the fall that had hurled me into oblivion. The room was empty except for the old manservant who lay near the door, moaning indistinctly. The door itself stood open, as if someone or something had gone out during my period of unconsciousness. I turned again to the bed with some instinctive, half-formed intention of trying to extinguish the blaze. The flames were spreading rapidly, were leaping higher, but they were not swift enough to veil from my sickened eyes the hands and features, if one could any longer call them such, of that which had been Sir John Tremeth. Of the last horror that had overtaken him, I must forbear explicit mention, and I would that I could likewise avoid the remembrance. All too tardily had the monster been frightened away by the fire. There is little more to tell. Looking back once more as I reeled from the smoke-laden room with Harper in my arms, I saw that the bed and its canopy had become a mass of mounting flames. The unhappy baronet had found in his own death chamber the funeral pyre for which he had longed. It was nearly dawn when we emerged from the doomed manor house. The rain had ceased, leaving a heaven lined with high and dead-gray clouds. The chill air appeared to revive the aged manservant, and he stood feebly beside me, uttering not a word, as we watched an ever-climbing spire of flame that broke from the somber roof of Tremouth Hall and began to cast a sullen glare on the unkempt hedges. In the combined light of the fireless dawn and the lurid conflagration, we both saw at our feet the semi-human, monstrous footprints, with their mark of long and canine nails, that had been trodden freshly and deeply in the rain-wet soil. They came from the direction of the manor house, and ran toward the heath-clad hill that rose behind it. Still without speaking, we followed the steps. Almost without interruption, they led to the entrance of the ancient family vaults, to the heavy iron door in the hillside that had been closed for a full generation by Sir John Tremouth's order. The door itself swung open, and we saw that its rusty chain and lock had been shattered by a strength that was more than the strength of man or beast. Then, peering within, we saw the clay-touched outline of the unreturning footprints that went downward into mausolean darkness on the stairs. We were both weaponless, having left our revolvers behind us in the death chamber, but we did not hesitate long. Harper possessed a liberal supply of matches, and looking about I found a heavy billet of water-soaked wood, which might serve in lieu of a cudgel. In grim silence, with tacit determination and forgetful of any danger, we conducted a thorough search of the well-nigh interminable vaults, striking match after match as we went on in the musty shadows. The traces of ghoulish footsteps grew fainter as we followed them into those black recesses, and we found nothing anywhere but noisome dampness and undisturbed cobwebs and the countless coffins of the dead. The thing that we sought had vanished utterly, as if swallowed up by the subterranean walls. At last we returned to the entrance. There, as we stood blinking in the full daylight with gray and haggard faces, Harper spoke for the first time, saying in his slow, tremulous voice,
Many years ago, soon after Lady Agatha's death, Sir John and I searched the vaults from end to end, but we could find no trace of the thing we suspected. Now, as then, it is useless to seek. There are mysteries which, God helping, will never be fathomed. We know only that the offspring of the vaults has gone back to the vaults. There may it remain.
Silently, in my shaken heart, I echoed his last words and his wish. The Return of the Sorcerer, by Asthon Smith. I had been out of work for several months, and my savings were perilously near the vanishing point. Therefore, I was naturally elated when I received from John Carnby a favorable answer, inviting me to present my qualifications in person. Carnby had advertised for a secretary, stipulating that all applicants must offer a preliminary statement of their capacities by letter, and I had written in response to the advertisement. Carnby, no doubt, was a scholarly recluse who felt averse to contact with a long waiting list of strangers, and he had chosen this manner of weeding out beforehand many, if not all, of those who were ineligible. He had specified his requirements fully and succinctly, and these were of such nature as to bar even the average well-educated person. A knowledge of Arabic was necessary, among other things, and luckily I had acquired a certain degree of scholarship in this unusual tongue. I found the address, of whose location I had formed only a vague idea, at the end of a hilltop avenue in the suburbs of Oakland. It was a large two-story house, overshaded by ancient oaks and dark with a mantling of unchecked ivy, among hedges of unpruned privet and shrubbery that had gone wild for many years. It was separated from its neighbors by a vacant, weed-grown lot on one side, and a tangle of vines and trees on the other, surrounding the black ruins of a burnt mansion. Even apart from its air of long neglect, there was something drear and dismal about the place, something that inhered in the ivy-blurred outlines of the house, in the furtive, shadowy windows, and the very forms of the misshapen oaks and oddly sprawling shrubbery. Somehow my elation became a trifle less exuberant as I entered the grounds and followed an unswept path to the front door. When I found myself in the presence of John Carnby, my jubilation was still somewhat further diminished, though I could not have given a tangible reason for the premonitory chill, the dull, somber feeling of alarm that I experienced, and the leaden sinking of my spirits. Perhaps it was the dark library in which he received me as much as the man himself, a room whose musty shadows could never have been wholly dissipated by sun or lamplight. Indeed, it must have been this, for John Carnby himself was very much the sort of person I had pictured him to be. He had all the earmarks of the lonely scholar who has devoted patient years to some line of erudite research. He was thin and bent, with a massive forehead and a mane of grizzled hair, and the pallor of the library was on his hollow, clean-shaven cheeks. But coupled with this, there was a nerve-shattered air, a fearful shrinking that was more than the normal shyness of a recluse, and an unceasing apprehensiveness that betrayed itself in every glance of his dark-ringed, feverish eyes and every movement of his bony hands. In all likelihood, his health had been seriously impaired by over-application, and I could not help but wonder at the nature of the studies that had made him a tremulous wreck. But there was something about him, perhaps the width of his bowed shoulders and the bold aquilinity of his facial outlines, which gave the impression of great former strength and a vigor not yet wholly exhausted. His voice was unexpectedly deep and sonorous.
"I think you will do, Mr. Ogden,"
he said after a few formal questions, most of which related to my linguistic knowledge, and in particular my mastery of Arabic.
"Your labors will not be very heavy, but I want someone who can be on hand at any time required. Therefore, you must live with me. I can give you a comfortable room, and I guarantee that my cooking will not poison you. I often work at night, and I hope you will not find the irregular hours too disagreeable."
No doubt I should have been overjoyed at this assurance that the secretarial position was to be mine. Instead, I was aware of a dim, unreasoning reluctance and an obscure forewarning of evil as I thanked John Carnby and told him that I was ready to move in whenever he desired. He appeared to be greatly pleased, and the queer apprehensiveness went out of his manner for a moment.
"Come immediately, this very afternoon if you can. I shall be very glad to have you, and the sooner the better. I have been living entirely alone for some time, and I must confess that the solitude is beginning to pall upon me. Also, I have been delayed in my labors for lack of the proper help. My brother used to live with me and assist me, but he has gone away on a long trip."
I returned to my downtown lodgings, paid my rent with the last few dollars that remained to me, packed my belongings, and in less than an hour was back at my new employer's home. He assigned me a room on the second floor, which, though unaired and dusty, was more than luxurious in comparison with the hall bedroom that failing funds had compelled me to inhabit for some time past. Then he took me to his own study, which was on the same floor, at the further end of the hall. Here, he explained to me, most of my future work would be done. I could hardly restrain an exclamation of surprise as I viewed the interior of this chamber. It was very much as I should have imagined the den of some old sorcerer to be. There were tables strewn with archaic instruments of doubtful use, with astrological charts, with skulls and alembics and crystals, with censers such as are used in the Catholic Church, and volumes bound in worm-eaten leather with verdigris-mottled clasps. In one corner stood the skeleton of a large ape, in another a human skeleton, and overhead a stuffed crocodile was suspended. There were cases overpiled with books, and even a cursory glance at the titles showed me that they formed a singularly comprehensive collection of ancient and modern works on demonology and the black arts. There were some weird paintings and etchings on the walls, dealing with kindred themes, and the whole atmosphere of the room exhaled a medley of half-forgotten superstitions. Ordinarily, I would have smiled at confronted with such things, but somehow, in this lonely, dismal house, beside the neurotic, hag-ridden Carnby, it was difficult for me to repress an actual shudder. On one of the tables, contrasting incongruously with this melange of medievalism and Satanism, there stood a typewriter, surrounded with piles of disorderly manuscript. At one end of the room there was a small curtained alcove with a bed in which Carnby slept. At the end opposite the alcove, between the human and simian skeletons, I perceived a locked cupboard that was set in the wall. Carnby had noted my surprise and was watching me with a keen, analytic expression which I found impossible to fathom. He began to speak in explanatory tones.
I have made a life study of demonism and sorcery. It is a fascinating field and one that is singularly neglected. I am now preparing a monograph in which I am trying to correlate the magical practices and demon worship of every known age and people. Your labors, at least for a while, will consist in typing and arranging the voluminous preliminary notes which I have made, and in helping me to track down other references and correspondences. Your knowledge of Arabic will be invaluable to me, for I am none too well grounded in this language myself, and I am depending for certain essential data on a copy of the Necronomicon in the original Arabic text. I have reason to think that there are certain omissions and erroneous renderings in the Latin version of Olaus Wormius.
I had heard of this rare, well-high, fabulous volume, but had never seen it. The book was supposed to contain the ultimate secrets of evil and forbidden knowledge, and moreover the original text written by the mad Arab, Abdul al-Hazred, was said to be unprocurable. I wondered how it had come into Carnby's possession.
I'll show you the volume after dinner. You will doubtless be able to elucidate one or two passages that have long puzzled me.
The evening meal, cooked and served by my employer himself, was a welcome change from cheap restaurant fare. Carnby seemed to have lost a good deal of his nervousness. He was very talkative, and even began to exhibit a certain scholarly gaiety after we had shared a bottle of mellow sauterne. Still, with no manifest reason, I was troubled by intimations and forebodings which I could neither analyze nor trace to their rightful source. We returned to the study, and Carnby brought out from a locked drawer the volume of which he had spoken. It was enormously old, and was bound in ebony covers arabesqued with silver and set with darkly glowing garnets. When I opened the yellowing pages, I drew back with involuntary revulsion at the odor which arose from them, an odor that was more than suggestive of physical decay, as if the book had lain among corpses in some forgotten graveyard and had taken on the taint of dissolution. Carnby's eyes were burning with a fevered light as he took the old manuscript from my hands and turned to a page near the middle. He indicated a certain passage with his lean forefinger.
Tell me what you make of this,
he said in a tense, excited whisper. I deciphered the paragraph, slowly and with some difficulty, and wrote down a rough English version with the pad and pencil which Carnby offered me. Then, at his request, I read it aloud. It is verily known by few, but is nevertheless an attestable fact, that the will of a dead sorcerer hath power upon his own body, and can raise it up from the tomb, and perform therewith whatever action was unfulfilled in life. And such resurrections are invariably for the doing of malevolent deeds, and for the detriment of others. Most readily can the corpse be animated if all its members have remained intact. And yet there are cases in which the excelling will of the wizard hath reared up from death the sundered pieces of a body hewn in many fragments, and hath caused them to serve his end, either separately or in a temporary reunion. But in every instance, after the action hath been completed, the body lapseth into its former state. Of course, all this was arrant gibberish. Probably it was the strange, unhealthy look of utter absorption with which my employer listened, more than that damnable passage from the Necronomicon, which caused my nervousness, and made me start violently when, toward the end of my reading, I heard an indescribable slithering noise in the hall outside. But when I finished the paragraph and looked up at Carnby, I was more startled by the expression of stark, staring fear which his features had assumed, an expression as of one who is haunted by some hellish phantom. Somehow, I got the feeling that he was listening to that odd noise in the hallway, rather than to my translation of Abdul al-Hazred.
The house is full of rats,
he explained as he caught my inquiring glance.
I have never been able to get rid of them with all my efforts.
The noise, which still continued, was that which a rat might make in dragging some object slowly along the floor. It seemed to draw closer, to approach the door of Carnby's room. And then, after an intermission, it began to move again and receded. My employer's agitation was marked. He listened with fearful intentness and seemed to follow the progress of the sound with a terror that mounted as it drew near and decreased a little with its recession.
I am very nervous. I have worked too hard lately, and this is the result. Even a little noise upsets me.
The sound had now died away somewhere in the house. Carnby appeared to recover himself in a measure.
Will you please reread your translation? I want to follow it very carefully, word by word.
I obeyed. He listened with the same look of unholy absorption as before, and this time we were not interrupted by any noises in the hallway. Carnby's face grew paler, as if the last remnant of blood had been drained from it, when I read the final sentences, and the fire in his hollow eyes was like phosphorescence in a deep vault.
That is a most remarkable passage. I was doubtful about its meaning, with my imperfect Arabic, and I have found that the passage is wholly omitted in the Latin of Olaus Wormius. Thank you for your scholarly rendering. You have certainly cleared it up for me.
His tone was dry and formal, as if he were repressing himself and holding back a world of unsurmisable thoughts and emotions. Somehow I felt that Carnby was more nervous and upset than ever, and also that my rendering from the Necronomicon had in some mysterious manner contributed to his perturbation. He wore a ghastly, brooding expression, as if his mind were busy with some unwelcome and forbidden theme. However, seeming to collect himself, he asked me to translate another passage. This turned out to be a singular incantatory formula for the exorcism of the dead, with a ritual that involved the use of rare Arabian spices and the proper intoning of at least 100 names of ghouls and demons. I copied it all out for Carnby, who studied it for a long time with a rapt eagerness that was more than scholarly.
That, too, is not in Olaus Wormius.
After perusing it again, he folded the paper carefully and put it away in the same drawer from which he had taken the Necronomicon. That evening was one of the strangest I have ever spent. As we sat for hour after hour discussing renditions from that unhallowed volume, I came to know more and more definitely that my employer was mortally afraid of something, that he dreaded being alone and was keeping me with him on this account rather than for any other reason. Always he seemed to be waiting and listening with a painful, tortured expectation, and I saw that he gave only a mechanical awareness to much that was said. Among the weird appurtenances of the room, in that atmosphere of unmanifested evil, of untold horror, the rational part of my mind began to succumb slowly to a recrudescence of dark ancestral fears, a scorner of such things in my normal moments. I was now ready to believe in the most baleful creations of superstitious fancy. No doubt, by some process of mental contagion, I had caught the hidden terror from which Carnby suffered. By no word or syllable, however, did the man admit the actual feelings that were evident in his demeanor, but he spoke repeatedly of a nervous ailment. More than once, during our discussion, he sought to imply that his interest in the supernatural and the satanic was wholly intellectual, that he, like myself, was without personal belief in such things. Yet I knew infallibly that his implications were false, that he was driven and obsessed by a real faith in all that he pretended to view with scientific detachment, and had doubtless been a victim to some imaginary horror entailed by his occult researches. But my intuition afforded me no clue to the actual nature of this horror. There was no repetition of the sounds that had been so disturbing to my employer. We must have sat till after midnight with the writings of the mad Arab open before us. At last Carnby seemed to realize the lateness of the hour.
I fear I have kept you up too long. You must go and get some sleep. I am selfish, and I forget that such hours are not habitual to others, as they are to me.
I made the formal denial of his self-impeachment which courtesy required, said good night, and sought my own chamber with a feeling of intense relief. It seemed to me that I would leave behind me in Carnby's room all the shadowy fear and oppression to which I had been subjected. Only one light was burning in the long passage. It was near Carnby's door, and my own door at the further end, close to the stairhead, was in deep shadow. As I groped for the knob, I heard a noise behind me, and turned to see in the gloom a small, indistinct body that sprang from the hall landing to the top stair, disappearing from view. I was horribly startled, for even in that vague, fleeting glimpse, the thing was much too pale for a rat, and its form was not at all suggestive of an animal. I could not have sworn what it was, but the outlines had seemed unmentionably monstrous. I stood trembling violently in every limb, and heard on the stairs a singular bumping sound like the fall of an object rolling downward from step to step. The sound was repeated at regular intervals, and finally ceased. If the safety of the soul and body had depended upon it, I could not have turned on the stair light, nor could I have gone to the top steps to ascertain the agency of that unnatural bumping. Anyone else, it might seem, would have done this. Instead, after a moment of virtual petrification, I entered my room, locked the door, and went to bed in a turmoil of unresolved doubt and equivocal terror. I left the light burning, and I lay awake for hours, expecting momentarily a recurrence of that abominable sound. But the house was as silent as a morgue, and I heard nothing. At length, in spite of my anticipations to the contrary, I fell asleep and did not awaken till after many sodden, dreamless hours. It was 10 o'clock, as my watch informed me. I wondered whether my employer had left me undisturbed through thoughtfulness, or had not arisen himself. I dressed and went downstairs to find him waiting at the breakfast table. He was paler and more tremulous than ever, as if he had slept badly.
I hope the rats didn't annoy you too much. Something really must be done about them.
I didn't notice them at all, I replied. Somehow it was utterly impossible for me to mention the queer, ambiguous thing which I had seen and heard on retiring the night before. Doubtless I had been mistaken. Doubtless it had been merely a rat, after all, dragging something down the stairs. I tried to forget the hideously repeated noise and the momentary flash of unthinkable outlines in the gloom, and my employer eyed me with uncanny sharpness, as if he sought to penetrate my inmost mind. Breakfast was a dismal affair, and the day that followed was no less dreary. Carnby isolated himself till the middle of the afternoon, and I was left to my own devices in the well-supplied but conventional library downstairs. What Carnby was doing alone in his room I could not surmise, but I thought more than once that I heard the faint, monotonous intonations of a solemn voice. Horror-breeding hints and noisome intuitions invaded my brain. More and more the atmosphere of that house enveloped and stifled me with poisonous miasmal mystery, and I felt everywhere the invisible brooding of malignant incubi. It was almost a relief when my employer summoned me to his study. Entering, I noticed that the air was full of a pungent, aromatic smell, and was touched by the vanishing coils of a blue vapor, as if from the burning of oriental gums and spices in the church censers. An Ispahan rug had been moved from its position near the wall to the center of the room, but was not sufficient to cover entirely a curving violet mark that suggested the drawing of a magic circle on the floor. No doubt Carnby had been performing some sort of incantation, and I thought of the awesome formula I had translated at his request. However, he did not offer any explanation of what he had been doing. His manner had changed remarkably, and was more controlled and confident than at any former time. In a fashion almost businesslike, he laid before me a pile of manuscript which he wanted me to type for him. The familiar click of the keys aided me somewhat in dismissing any apprehensions of vague evil, and I could almost smile at the recherche and terrific information comprised in my employer's notes, which dealt mainly with formulae for the acquisition of unlawful power. But still, beneath my reassurance, there was a vague, lingering disquietude. Evening came, and after our meal we returned again to the study. There was a tenseness in Carnby's manner now, as if he were eagerly awaiting the result of some hidden test. I went on with my work, but some of his emotion communicated itself to me, and ever and anon I caught myself in an attitude of strained listening. At last, above the click of the keys, I heard the peculiar slithering in the hall. Carnby had heard it too, and his confident look utterly vanished, giving place to the most pitiable fear. The sound drew nearer and was followed by a dull, dragging noise, and then by more sounds of an unidentifiable slithering and scuttling nature that varied in loudness. The hall was seemingly full of them, as if a whole army of rats were hauling some carrion booty along the floor. And yet no rodent or number of rodents could have made such sounds, or could have moved anything so heavy as the object which came behind the rest. There was something in the character of those noises, something without name or definition, which caused a slowly creeping chill to invade my spine. "Good Lord, what is all that racket?" I cried.
The rats! I tell you it is only the rats.
Carnby's voice was a high, hysterical shriek. A moment later there came an unmistakable knocking on the door, near the sill. At the same time I heard a heavy thudding in the locked cupboard at the further end of the room. Carnby had been standing erect, but now he sank limply into a chair. His features were ashen and his look was almost maniacal with fright. The nightmare doubt and tension became unbearable, and I ran to the door and flung it open, in spite of a frantic remonstrance from my employer. I had no idea what I should find as I stepped across the sill into the dim-lit hall. When I looked down and saw the thing on which I had almost trodden, my feeling was one of sick amazement and actual nausea. It was a human hand which had been severed at the wrist, a bony, bluish hand like that of a week-old corpse, with garden mold on the fingers and under the long nails. The damnable thing had moved. It had drawn back to avoid me, and was crawling along the passage somewhat in the manner of a crab. And following it with my gaze, I saw that there were other things beyond it, one of which I recognized as a man's foot, and another as a forearm. I dared not look at the rest. All were moving slowly, hideously away in a charnel procession, and I cannot describe the fashion in which they moved, their individual vitality horrifying beyond endurance. It was more than the vitality of life, yet the air was laden with a carrion taint. I averted my eyes and stepped back into Carnby's room, closing the door behind me with a shaking hand. Carnby was at my side with the key, which he turned in the lock with palsy-stricken fingers that had become as feeble as those of an old man.
You saw them?
He asked in a dry, quavering whisper. "In God's name, what does it all mean?" I cried. Carnby went back to his chair, tottering a little with weakness. His lineaments were agonized by the gnawing of some inward horror, and he shook visibly like an ague patient. I sat down in a chair beside him, and he began to stammer forth his unbelievable confession, half incoherently, with inconsequential mouthings and many breaks and pauses.
He is stronger than I am, even in death, even with his body dismembered by the surgeon's knife and saw that I used. I thought he could not return after that, after I had buried the portions in a dozen different places, in the cellar, beneath the shrubs, at the foot of the ivy vines. But the Necronomicon is right, and Helman Carnby knew it. He warned me before I killed him. He told me he could return, even in that condition, but I did not believe him. I hated Helman, and he hated me too. He had attained to higher power and knowledge, and was more favored by the Dark Ones than I. That was why I killed him, my own twin brother, and my brother in the service of Satan and of those who were before Satan. We had studied together for many years. We had celebrated the Black Mass together, and we were attended by the same familiars. But Helman Carnby had gone deeper into the occult, into the forbidden, where I could not follow him. I feared him, and I could not endure his supremacy. It is more than a week. It is 10 days since I did the deed. But Helman, or some part of him, has returned every night. God, his accursed hands crawling on the floor, his feet, his arms, the segments of his legs, climbing the stairs in some unmentionable way to haunt me. Christ, his awful bloody torso lying in wait. I tell you, his hands have come even by day to tap and fumble at my door, and I have stumbled over his arms in the dark. Oh, God, I shall go mad with the awfulness of it. But he wants me to go mad. He wants to torture me till my brain gives way. That is why he haunts me in this piecemeal fashion. He could end it all any time with the demoniacal power that is his. He could reknit his sundered limbs and body and slay me as I slew him. How carefully I buried the parts, with what infinite forethought, and how useless it was. I buried the saw and knife, too, at the farther end of the garden, as far away as possible from his evil, itching hands. But I did not bury the head with the other pieces. I kept it in that cupboard at the end of my room. Sometimes I have heard it moving there, as you heard it a little while ago. But he does not need the head. His will is elsewhere, and can work intelligently through all his members. Of course, I locked all the doors and windows at night when I found that he was coming back, but it made no difference. And I have tried to exorcise him with the appropriate incantations, with all those that I knew. Today I tried that sovereign formula from the Necronomicon, which you translated for me. I got you here to translate it. Also, I could no longer bear to be alone, and I thought that it might help if there were someone else in the house. That formula was my last hope. I thought it would hold him. It is a most ancient and most dreadful incantation. But as you have seen, it is useless.
His voice trailed off in a broken mumble, and he sat staring before him with sightless, intolerable eyes, in which I saw the beginning flare of madness. I could say nothing. The confession he had made was so ineffably atrocious. The moral shock and the ghastly supernatural horror had almost stupefied me. My sensibilities were stunned, and it was not till I had begun to recover that I felt the irresistible surge of a flood of loathing for the man beside me. I rose to my feet. The house had grown very silent, as if the macabre and charnel army of beleaguerment had now retired to its various graves. Carnby had left the key in the lock, and I went to the door and turned it quickly.
Are you leaving? Don't go.
Carnby begged in a voice that was tremulous with alarm as I stood with my hand on the doorknob. Yes, I am going, I said coldly. I am resigning my position right now, and I intend to pack my belongings and leave your house with as little delay as possible. I opened the door and went out, refusing to listen to the arguments and pleadings and protestations he had begun to babble. For the nonce, I preferred to face whatever might lurk in the gloomy passage, no matter how loathsome and terrifying, rather than endure any longer the society of John Carnby. The hall was empty, but I shuddered with repulsion at the memory of what I had seen as I hastened to my room. I think I should have screamed aloud at the least sound or movement in the shadows. I began to pack my valise with a feeling of the most frantic urgency and compulsion. It seemed to me that I could not escape soon enough from that house of abominable secrets, over which hung an atmosphere of smothering menace. I made mistakes in my haste. I stumbled over chairs, and my brain and fingers grew numb with a paralyzing dread. I had almost finished my task when I heard the sound of slow, measured footsteps coming up the stairs. I knew that it was not Carnby, for he had locked himself immediately in his room when I had left, and I felt sure that nothing could have tempted him to emerge. Anyway, he could hardly have gone downstairs without my hearing him. The footsteps came to the top landing and went past my door along the hall, with that same dead, monotonous repetition, regular as the movement of a machine. Certainly it was not the soft, nervous tread of John Carnby. Who, then, could it be? My blood stood still in my veins. I dared not finish the speculation that arose in my mind. The steps paused, and I knew that they had reached the door of Carnby's room. There followed an interval in which I could scarcely breathe, and then I heard an awful crashing and shattering noise, and above it the soaring scream of a man in the uttermost extremity of fear. I was powerless to move, as if an unseen iron hand had reached forth to restrain me, and I have no idea how long I waited and listened. The scream had fallen away in a swift silence, and I heard nothing now, except a low, peculiar, recurrent sound which my brain refused to identify. It was not my own volition, but a stronger will than mine, which drew me forth at last and impelled me down the hall to Carnby's study. I felt the presence of that will as an overpowering, superhuman thing, a demoniac force, a malign mesmerism. The door of the study had been broken in and was hanging by one hinge. It was splintered as by the impact of more than mortal strength. A light was still burning in the room, and the unmentionable sound I had been hearing ceased as I neared the threshold. It was followed by an evil, utter stillness. Again I paused and could go no further. But this time it was something other than the hellish, all-pervading magnetism that petrified my limbs and arrested me before the sill. Peering into the room, in the narrow space that was framed by the doorway and lit by an unseen lamp, I saw one end of the oriental rug and the gruesome outlines of a monstrous, unmoving shadow that fell beyond it on the floor. Huge, elongated, misshapen, the shadow was seemingly cast by the arms and torso of a naked man who stooped forward with a surgeon's saw in his hand. Its monstrosity lay in this. Though the shoulders, chest, abdomen, and arms were all clearly distinguishable, the shadow was headless and appeared to terminate in an abruptly severed neck. It was impossible, considering the relative position, for the head to have been concealed from sight through any manner of foreshortening. I waited, powerless to enter or withdraw. The blood had flowed back upon my heart in an ice-thick tide, and thought was frozen in my brain. An interval of termless horror, and then, from the hidden end of Carnby's room, from the direction of the locked cupboard, there came a fearsome and violent crash, and the sound of splintering wood and whining hinges, followed by the sinister, dismal thud of an unknown object striking the floor. Again there was silence, a silence as of consummated evil brooding above its unnameable triumph. The shadow had not stirred. There was a hideous contemplation in its attitude, and the saw was still held in its poising hand, as if above a completed task. Another interval, and then, without warning, I witnessed the awful and unexplainable disintegration of the shadow, which seemed to break gently and easily into many different shadows ere it faded from view. I hesitate to describe the manner, or specify the places, in which this singular disruption, this manifold cleavage, occurred. Simultaneously, I heard the muffled clatter of a metallic implement on the Persian rug, and a sound that was not that of a single body, but of many bodies falling. Once more there was silence, a silence as of some nocturnal cemetery, when grave-diggers and ghouls are done with their macabre toil, and the dead alone remain. Drawn by that baleful mesmerism, like a somnambulist led by an unseen demon, I entered the room. I knew with a loathly prescience the sight that awaited me beyond the sill, the double heap of human segments, some of them fresh and bloody, and others already blue with beginning putrefaction and marked with earth stains, that were mingled in abhorrent confusion on the rug. A reddened knife and saw were protruding from the pile, and a little to one side, between the rug and the open cupboard with its shattered door, there reposed a human head that was fronting the other remnants in an upright posture. It was in the same condition of incipient decay as the body to which it had belonged. But I swear that I saw the fading of a malignant exultation from its features as I entered. Even with the marks of corruption upon them, the lineaments bore a manifest likeness of John Carnby, and plainly they could belong only to a twin brother. The frightful inferences that smothered my brain with their black and clammy cloud are not to be written here. The horror which I beheld, and the greater horror which I surmised, would have put to shame hell's foulest enormities in their frozen pits. There was but one mitigation and one mercy. I was compelled to gaze only for a few instants on that intolerable scene. Then, all at once, I felt that something had withdrawn from the room. The malign spell was broken. The overpowering volition that had held me captive was gone. It had released me now, even as it had released the dismembered corpse of Helman Carnby. I was free to go, and I fled from the ghastly chamber and ran headlong through an unlit house and into the outer darkness of the night.
Ubbo-Sathla by Asthon Smith. For Ubbo-Sathla is the source and the end. Before the coming of Xothaqua or Yog-Sothoth or Cthulhut from the stars, Ubbo-Sathla dwelt in the steaming fens of the new-made earth, a mass without head or members, spawning the grey formless efts of the prime and the grisly prototypes of terrene life. And all earthly life, it is told, shall go back at last through the great circle of time to Ubbo-Sathla, the Book of Abon. Paul Tragardis found the milky crystal in a litter of oddments from many lands and eras. He had entered the shop of the curio dealer through an aimless impulse, with no particular object in mind, other than the idle distraction of eyeing and fingering a miscellany of far-gathered things. Looking desultorily about, his attention had been drawn by a dull glimmering on one of the tables, and he had extricated the queer orb-like stone from its shadowy, crowded position between an ugly little Aztec idol, the fossil egg of a Dinornis, and an obscene fetish of black wood from the Niger. The thing was about the size of a small orange, and was slightly flattened at the ends, like a planet at its poles. It puzzled Tragardis, for it was not like an ordinary crystal, being cloudy and changeable, with an intermittent glowing in its heart, as if it were alternately illumined and darkened from within. Holding it to the wintry window, he studied it for a while without being able to determine the secret of this singular and regular alternation. His puzzlement was soon complicated by a dawning sense of vague and irrecognizable familiarity, as if he had seen the thing before under circumstances that were now wholly forgotten. He appealed to the curio dealer, a dwarfish Hebrew with an air of dusty antiquity, who gave the impression of being lost to commercial considerations in some web of Kabbalistic reverie. "Can you tell me anything about this?" The dealer gave an indescribable, simultaneous shrug of his shoulders and his eyebrows. "It is very old. Paleogean, one might say. I cannot tell you much, for little is known. A geologist found it in Greenland beneath glacial ice in the Miocene strata. Who knows? It may have belonged to some sorcerer of primeval Thule. Greenland was a warm, fertile region beneath the sun of Miocene times. No doubt it is a magic crystal, and a man might behold strange visions in its heart if he looked long enough." Tragardis was quite startled, for the dealer's apparently fantastic suggestion had brought to mind his own delvings in a branch of obscure lore, and in particular had recalled the Book of Eibon, that strangest and rarest of occult forgotten volumes, which is said to have come down through a series of manifold translations from a prehistoric original, written in the lost language of Hyperborea. Tragardis, with much difficulty, had obtained the medieval French version, a copy that had been owned by many generations of sorcerers and Satanists, but had never been able to find the Greek manuscript from which the version was derived. The remote, fabulous original was supposed to have been the work of a great Hyperborean wizard from whom it had taken its name. It was a collection of dark and baleful myths, of liturgies, rituals and incantations, both evil and esoteric. Not without shudders, in the course of studies that the average person would have considered more than singular, Tragardis had collated the French volume with the frightful Necronomicon of the mad Arab Abdul al-Hazred. He had found many correspondences of the blackest and most appalling significance, together with much forbidden data that was either unknown to the Arab or omitted by him or by his translators. Was this what he had been trying to recall? Tragardis wondered. The brief casual reference in the Book of Eibon to a cloudy crystal that had been owned by the wizard Zon Mezamalek in Mu Thulan. Of course, it was all too fantastic, too hypothetic, too incredible. But Mu Thulan, that northern portion of ancient Hyperborea, was supposed to have corresponded roughly with Modem Greenland, which had formerly been joined as a peninsula to the main continent. Could the stone in his hand, by some fabulous fortuity, be the crystal of Zon Mezamalek? Tragardis smiled at himself with inward irony for even conceiving the absurd notion. Such things did not occur, at least not in present-day London, and in all likelihood, the Book of Eibon was sheer superstitious fantasy anyway. Nevertheless, there was something about the crystal that continued to tease and inveigle him. He ended by purchasing it at a fairly moderate price. The sum was named by the seller and paid by the buyer without bargaining. With the crystal in his pocket, Paul Tragardis hastened back to his lodgings instead of resuming his leisurely saunter. He installed the milky globe on his writing table, where it stood firmly enough on one of its oblate ends. Then, still smiling at his own absurdity, he took down the yellow parchment manuscript of the Book of Eibon from its place in a somewhat inclusive collection of recherche literature. He opened the vermiculated leather cover with hasps of tarnished steel and read over to himself, translating from the archaic French as he read, the paragraph that referred to Zon Mezamalek. This wizard, who was mighty among sorcerers, had found a cloudy stone, orb-like and somewhat flattened at the ends, in which he could behold many visions of the terrene past, even to the earth's beginning, when Ubbo-Sathla, the unbegotten source, lay vast and swollen and yeasty amid the vaporing slime. But of that which he beheld, Zon Mezamalek left little record, and people say that he vanished presently, in a way that is not known, and after him the cloudy crystal was lost. Paul Tragardis laid the manuscript aside. Again there was something that tantalized and beguiled him, like a lost dream or a memory forfeit to oblivion. Impelled by a feeling which he did not scrutinize or question, he sat down before the table and began to stare intently into the cold, nebulous orb. He felt an expectation which, somehow, was so familiar, so permeative a part of his consciousness, that he did not even name it to himself. Minute by minute he sat and watched the alternate glimmering and fading of the mysterious light in the heart of the crystal. By imperceptible degrees, there stole upon him a sense of dreamlike duality, both in respect to his person and his surroundings. He was still Paul Tragardis, and yet he was someone else. The room was his London apartment, and a chamber in some foreign but well-known place. And in both milieus, he peered steadfastly into the same crystal. After an interim, without surprise on the part of Tragardis, the process of re-identification became complete. He knew that he was Zon Mezamalek, a sorcerer of Mu-Thulan, and a student of all lore anterior to his own epoch. Wise with dreadful secrets that were not known to Paul Tragardis, amateur of anthropology and the occult sciences in latter-day London, he sought by means of the milky crystal to attain an even older and more fearful knowledge. He had acquired the stone in dubitable ways, from a more than sinister source. It was unique and without fellow in any land or time. In its depths, all former years, all things that have ever been, were supposedly mirrored and would reveal themselves to the patient visionary. And through the crystal, Zon Mezamalek had dreamt to recover the wisdom of the gods who died before the earth was born. They had passed to the lightless void, leaving their lore inscribed upon tablets of ultra-stellar stone, and the tablets were guarded in the primal Maya by the formless, idiotic demiurge, Ubbo-Sathla. Only by means of the crystal could he hope to find and read the tablets. For the first time, he was making trial of the globe's reputed virtues. About him, an ivory-paneled chamber, filled with his magic books and paraphernalia, was fading slowly from his consciousness. Before him, on a table of some dark Hyperborean wood that had been graven with grotesque ciphers, the crystal appeared to swell and deepen, and in its filmy depth he beheld a swift and broken swirling of dim scenes, fleeting like the bubbles of a mill race, as if he looked upon an actual world. Cities, forests, mountains, seas and meadows flowed beneath him, lightening and darkening as with the passage of days and nights in some weirdly accelerated stream of time. Zon Mezamalek had forgotten Paul Tragardis, had lost the remembrance of his own entity and his own surroundings in Mu-Thulan. Moment by moment, the flowing vision in the crystal became more definite and distinct, and the orb itself deepened till he grew giddy, as if he were peering from an insecure height into some never-fathomed abyss. He knew that time was racing backward in the crystal, was unrolling for him the pageant of all past days, but a strange alarm had seized him, and he feared to gaze longer. Like one who has nearly fallen from a precipice, he caught himself with a violent start and drew back from the mystic orb. Again, to his gaze, the enormous whirling world into which he had peered was a small and cloudy crystal on his rune-wrought table in Mu-Thulan. Then, by degrees, it seemed that the great room with sculptured panels of mammoth ivory was narrowing to another and dingier place, and Zon Mezamalek, losing his preternatural wisdom and sorcerous power, went back by a weird regression into Paul Tragardis, and yet not wholly, it seemed, was he able to return. Tragardis, dazed and wondering, found himself before the writing table on which he had set the oblate sphere. He felt the confusion of one who has dreamt and has not yet fully awakened from the dream. The room puzzled him vaguely, as if something were wrong with its size and furnishings, and his remembrance of purchasing the crystal from a curio dealer was oddly and discrepantly mingled with an impression that he had acquired it in a very different manner. He felt that something very strange had happened to him when he peered into the crystal, but just what it was, he could not seem to recollect. It had left him in the sort of psychic muddlement that follows a debauch of hashish. He assured himself that he was Paul Tragardis, that he lived on a certain street in London, that the year was 1932. But such commonplace verities had somehow lost their meaning and their validity, and everything about him was shadow-like and insubstantial. The very walls seemed to waver like smoke. The people in the streets were phantoms of phantoms, and he himself was a lost shadow, a wandering echo of something long forgot, He resolved that he would not repeat his experiment of crystal gazing. The effects were too unpleasant and equivocal. But the very next day, by an unreasoning impulse to which he yielded almost mechanically, without reluctation, he found himself seated before the misty orb. Again he became the sorcerer, Zon Mezamalek in Mu-Thulan. Again he dreamt to retrieve the wisdom of the anti-mundane gods. Again he drew back from the deepening crystal with the terror of one who fears to fall. And once more, but doubtfully and dimly, like a failing wraith, he was Paul Tragardis. 3 times did Tragardis repeat the experience on successive days, and each time his own person and the world about him became more tenuous and confused than before. His sensations were those of a dreamer who is on the verge of waking, and London itself was unreal as the lands that slipped from the dreamer's ken, receding in filmy mist and cloudy light. Beyond it all, he felt the looming and crowding of vast imageries, alien but half familiar. It was as if the phantasmagoria of time and space were dissolving about him, to reveal some veritable reality, or another dream of space and time. There came at last the day when he sat down before the crystal and did not return as Paul Tragardis. It was the day when Zon Mezamalek, boldly disregarding certain evil and portentous warnings, resolved to overcome his curious fear of failing bodily into the visionary world that he beheld, a fear that had hitherto prevented him from following the backward stream of time for any distance. He must, he assured himself, conquer this fear if he were ever to see and read the lost tablets of the gods. He had beheld nothing more than a few fragments of the years of Mu-Thulan, immediately posterior to the present, the years of his own lifetime, and there were inestimable cycles between these years and the beginning. Again, to his gaze, the crystal deepened immeasurably, with scenes and happenings that flowed in a retrograde stream. Again the magic ciphers of the dark table faded from his ken, and the sorcerously carven walls of his chamber melted into less than dream. Once more he grew giddy with an awful vertigo as he bent above the swirling and milling of the terrible gulfs of time in the world-like orb. Fearfully, in spite of his resolution, he would have drawn away. But he had looked and leaned too long. There was a sense of abysmal falling, a suction as of ineluctable winds, of maelstroms that bore him down through fleet, unstable visions of his own past life into antenatal years and dimensions. He seemed to endure the pangs of an inverse dissolution, and then he was no longer Zon Mezamalek, the wise and learned watcher of the crystal, but an actual part of the weirdly racing stream that ran back to reattain the beginning. He seemed to live unnumbered lives, to die myriad deaths, forgetting each time the death and life that had gone before. He fought as a warrior in half-legendary battles. He was a child playing in the ruins of some olden city of Mu-Thulan. He was the king who had reigned when the city was in its prime, the prophet who had foretold its building and its doom. A woman, he wept for the bygone dead in necropoli long crumbled. An antique wizard, he muttered the rude spells of earlier sorcery. A priest of some pre-human god, he wielded the sacrificial knife in cave temples of pillared basalt. Life by life, era by era, he retraced the long and groping cycles through which Hyperborea had risen from savagery to a high civilization. He became a barbarian of some troglodytic tribe, fleeing from the slow, turreted ice of a former glacial age into lands illumined by the ruddy flare of perpetual volcanoes. Then, after incomputable years, he was no longer man, but a man-like beast, roving in forests of giant fern and calamite, or building an uncouth nest in the boughs of mighty cycads. Through eons of anterior sensation, of crude lust and hunger, of aboriginal terror and madness, there was someone, or something, that went ever backward in time. Death became birth, and birth was death. In a slow vision of reverse change, the earth appeared to melt away and sloughed off the hills and mountains of its latter strata. Always the sun grew larger and hotter above the fuming swamps that teemed with a crasser life, with a more fulsome vegetation. And the thing that had been Paul Tragardis, that had been Zon Mezamalek, was a part of all the monstrous devolution. It flew with the claw-tipped wings of a pterodactyl, It swam in tepid seas with the vast winding bulk of an ichthyosaurus. It bellowed uncouthly with the armored throat of some forgotten behemoth to the huge moon that burned through primordial mists. At length, after eons of immemorial brutehood, it became one of the lost serpent men who reared their cities of black gneiss and fought their venomous wars in the world's first continent. It walked undulously in anti-human streets, in strange crooked vaults. It peered at primeval stars from high Babylonian towers. It bowed with hissing litanies to great serpent idols. Through years and ages of the Ophidian era it returned, and was a thing that crawled in the ooze, that had not yet learned to think and dream and build. And the time came when there was no longer a continent, but only a vast chaotic marsh, a sea of slime, without limit or horizon, without shore or elevation, that seethed with a blind writhing of amorphous vapors. There, in the grey beginning of earth, the formless mass that was Ubbo-Sathla reposed amid the slime and the vapors. Headless, without organs or members, it sloughed from its oozy sides, in a slow, ceaseless wave, the amoebic forms that were the archetypes of earthly life. Horrible it was, if there had been aught to apprehend the horror, and loathsome, if there had been any to feel loathing. About it, prone or tilted in the mire, there lay the mighty tablets of star-quarried stone that were writ with the inconceivable wisdom of the pre-mundane gods. And there, to the goal of a forgotten search, was drawn the thing that had been, or would sometime be, Poltergeist and Zon Mesamalek. Becoming a shapeless eft of the prime, it crawled sluggishly and obliviously across the fallen tablets of the gods, and fought and ravened blindly with the other spawn of Ubbo-Sathla. Of Zon Mesamalek and his vanishing, there is no mention anywhere, save the brief passage in the Book of Ibon. Concerning Poltergeist, who also disappeared, there was a curt notice in several of the London papers. No one seems to have known anything about him. He is gone as if he had never been, and the crystal presumably is gone too. At least no one has found it.